Today, in Audiobooks for Me, we are going to listen to Tarzan and the Golden Lion by Edgar Rice Burroughs. This book is divided in 3 videos. This is Part 2. We hope you enjoy it. Chapter 10. Mad Treachery. To the northwest of the valley of Opar, the smoke rose from the cook fires of a camp in which some 100 blacks and 6 whites were eating their evening meal. The Negroes squatted sullen and morose, mumbling together in low tones over their meager fare. The whites, scowling and apprehensive, kept their firearms close at hand. One of them, a girl, and the only member of her sex in the party, was addressing her fellows. "We have Adolph's stinginess and Esteban's braggadocio to thank for the condition in which we are," she said. The fat Blueber shrugged his shoulder. The big Spaniard scowled. "For why?" asked Adolph. "Am I to blame?" "You were too stingy to employ enough carriers. I told you at the time that we ought to have had 200 blacks in our party. But you wanted to save a little money, and now what is the result? 50 men carrying 80 pounds of gold apiece, and the other carriers are overburdened with camp equipment, while there are scarce enough left for Ascari to guard us properly. We have to drive them like beasts to make any progress, and to keep them from throwing away their loads, and they are fagged out and angry. They don't require much of an excuse to kill us all on the spot. On top of all this, they are underfed. If we could keep their bellies filled, we could probably keep them happy and reasonably contented. But I have learned enough about natives to know that if they are hungry, they are neither happy nor contented, even in idleness. If Esteban had not bragged so much about his prowess as a hunter, we should have brought enough provisions to last us through. But now, though we are barely started upon our return journey, we are upon less than half rations." "I can't kill game when there isn't any game," growled the Spaniard. "There is plenty of game," said Krasky, the Russian. "We see the tracks of it every day." The Spaniard eyed him venomously. "If there is so much game," he said, "go out and get it yourself." "I never claimed to be a hunter," replied Krasky, "though I could go out with a slingshot and a pea-shooter and do as well as you have." The Spaniard leaped to his feet menacingly, and instantly the Russian covered him with a heavy service revolver. "Cut that business," cried the girl sharply, leaping between them. "Let the blighters fight," growled John Peebles. "If one of 'em kills the other, there'll be fewer to split the swag, and here we are, and that's that." "For why should we quarrel?" demanded Blueber. "There is enough for all, over 43,000 pounds apiece. When you get mad at me, you call me a dirty Jew and say dat I am stingy. But mein Gott, you Christians are worser. You would kill one of your friends to get more money. Oi, thank God that I am not a Christian." "Shut up," growled Throck, "or we'll have 43,000 pounds more to divide." Blueber eyed the big Englishman fearfully. Come, Dick," he oozed in his oiliest tones. "You wouldn't get mad at a ladle choke, would you? And me your best friend?" "I'm sick of all this grousin'," said Throck. "I hain't no highbrow. I hain't nothing but a pug. But I got sense enough to know that Flora's the only one in the bloomin' bunch whose brains wouldn't rattle around in a peanut shell. John, Blueber, Krasky, and me, we're here because we could raise the money to carry out Flora's plan. The Dago there," and he indicated Esteban, because his face and his figure filled the bill. "There don't any of us need no brains for this work, and there ain't any of us got any more brains than we need. Flora's the brains of this outfit, and the sooner everyone understands that and takes orders from her, the better off we'll all be. She's been to Africa with this Lord Greystoke fella before. You was his wife's maid, wasn't you, Flora? And she knows something about the country and the natives and the animals, and there don't none of us know nothin'." "Throck is right," said Krasky quickly. "We've been muddling long enough. We haven't had a boss, and the thing to do is to make Flora boss from now on. If anyone can get us out of this, she can. And from the way those fellows over there are acting," and he nodded toward the blacks, "we'll be lucky if we ever get out with our skins, let alone taking any of the gold with us." Oi, you don't mean to leave the gold?" almost shrieked Bloober. "I mean that we do whatever Flora thinks best," replied Krasky. "If she says to leave the gold, we'll leave it." "That we do," seconded Throck. "I'm for it," said Peebles. "Whatever Flora says goes." The Spaniard nodded his assent sullenly. "The rest of us are all for it, Bloober." "How about you?" asked Krasky. "Oh, well, sure, if you say so," said Bloober. "And as John says, and here we ain't unvatstat." "And now, Flora," said Peebles, "you're the big un. What you say goes. What'll we do next?" "Very well," said the girl. "We shall camp here until these men are rested, and early tomorrow we'll start out intelligently and systematically and get meat for them. With their help, we can do it. When they are rested and well fed, we will start on again for the coast, moving very slowly so as not to tire them too much. This is my first plan, but it all hinges upon our ability to get meat. If we do not find it, I shall bury the gold here, and we will do our best to reach the coast as quickly as possible. There we shall recruit new porters, twice as many as we have now, and purchase enough provisions to carry us in and out again. As we come back in, we will cache provisions at every camping place for our return trip, thus saving the necessity of carrying heavy loads all the way in and out again. In this way, we can come out light, with twice as many porters as we actually need, and by working them in shifts, we will travel much faster and there will be no grumbling. These are my two plans. I am not asking you what you think of them, because I do not care. You have made me chief, and I am going to run this from now on as I think best." "Bully for you," roared Peebles. "That's the kind of talk I likes to hear." "Tell the headman I want to see him, Carl," said the girl, turning to Krasky, and a moment later the Russian returned, with a burly Negro. "Oh, Wazza," said the girl, as the black halted before her, "we are short of food, and the men are burdened with loads twice as heavy as they should carry. Tell them that we shall wait here until they are rested, and that tomorrow we shall all go out and hunt for meat. You will send your boys out under 3 good men, and they will act as beaters and drive the game into us. In this way, we should get plenty of meat, and when the men are rested and well fed, we will move on slowly. Where game is plentiful, we will hunt and rest. Tell them that if they do this, and we reach the coast in safety and with all our loads, I shall pay them twice what they agreed to come for." "Oi, oi," spluttered Bloober. "Twice vat they agreed to come for. Oh, Flora, why not offer them 10%? Dot would be fine interest on their money." "Shut up, you fool," snapped Krasky, and Bloober subsided, though he rocked back and forth, shaking his head in disapproval. The black, who had presented himself for the interview with sullen and scowling demeanor, brightened visibly now. "I will tell them," he said, "and I think that you will have no more trouble." "Good," said Flora. "Go and tell them now," and the black turned and left. "There," said the girl with a sigh of relief. "I believe that we can see light ahead at last." "Device vat we promised to pay them," bawled Bloober. "Oi, oi." Early the following morning they prepared to set out upon the hunt. The blacks were now smiling and happy in anticipation of plenty of meat, and as they tramped off into the jungle, they were singing gaily. Flora had divided them into 3 parties, each under a headman, with explicit directions for the position each party was to take in the line of beaters. Others had been detailed to the whites as gun-bearers, while a small party of the Askari were left behind to guard the camp. The whites, with the exception of Esteban, were armed with rifles. He alone seemed inclined to question Flora's authority, insisting that he preferred to hunt with spear and arrows, in keeping with the part he was playing. The fact that though he had hunted assiduously for weeks, yet had never brought in a single kill, was not sufficient to dampen his egotism. So genuinely had he entered his part that he really thought he was Tarzan of the apes, and with such fidelity had he equipped himself in every detail, and such a master of the art of makeup was he, that, in conjunction with his splendid figure and his handsome face, that were almost a counterpart of Tarzan's, it was scarcely to be wondered at that he almost fooled himself as successfully as he had fooled others. For there were men among the carriers who had known the great ape-man, and even these were deceived, though they wondered at the change in him, since in little things he did not deport himself as Tarzan, and in the matter of kills he was disappointing. Flora Hawkes, who was endowed with more than a fair share of intelligence, realized that it would not be well to cross any of her companions unnecessarily, and so she permitted Esteban to hunt that morning in his own way, though some of the others grumbled a little at her decision. "What is the difference?" she asked them after the Spaniard had set out alone. "The chances are that he could use a rifle no better than he uses his spear and arrows. Carl and Dick are really the only shots among us, and it is upon them we depend principally for the success of our hunt today. Esteban's egotism has been so badly bumped that it is possible that he will go to the last extremity to make a kill today. Let us hope that he is successful." "I hope he breaks his fool neck," said Krasky. "He has served our purpose, and we would be better off if we were rid of him." The girl shook her head negatively. "No," she said. "We must not think or speak of anything of that kind. We went into this thing together. Let us stick together until the end. If you are wishing that one of us is dead, how do you know that others are not wishing that you were dead?" "I haven't any doubt but that Miranda wishes I were dead," replied Krasky. "I never go to bed at night without thinking that the damned greaser may try to stick a knife into me before morning, and it don't make me feel any kinder toward him to hear you defending him, Flora. You've been a bit soft on him from the start." "If I have, it's none of your business," retorted the girl. And so they started out upon their hunt, the Russian scowling and angry, harboring thoughts of vengeance or worse against Esteban, and Esteban, hunting through the jungle, was occupied with his hatred and his jealousy. His dark mind was open to every chance suggestion of a means for putting the other men of the party out of the way and taking the woman and the gold for himself. He hated them all. In each he saw a possible rival for the affections of Flora, and in the death of each he saw not only one less suitor for the girl's affections, but 43,000 additional pounds to be divided among fewer people. His mind was thus occupied to the exclusion of the business of hunting, which should have occupied him solely, when he came through a patch of heavy underbrush and stepped into the glaring sunlight of a large clearing, face to face with a party of some 50 magnificent ebon warriors. For just an instant, Esteban stood frozen in a paralysis of terror, forgetting momentarily the part he was playing, thinking of himself only as a lone white man in the heart of savage Africa, facing a large band of warlike natives, cannibals perhaps. It was that moment of utter silence and inaction that saved him, for as he stood thus before them, the Waziri saw in the silent majestic figure, their beloved lord, in a characteristic pose. "Oh, Bwana, Bwana," cried one of the warriors, rushing forward. "It is indeed you, Tarzan of the apes, lord of the jungle, whom we had given up as lost. We, your faithful Waziri, have been searching for you, and even now we were about to dare the dangers of Opar, fearing that you might have ventured there without us and had been captured." The black, who had at one time accompanied Tarzan to London as a body servant, spoke broken English, an accomplishment of which he was inordinately proud. Losing no opportunity to air his attainment before his less fortunate fellows, the fact that it had been he whom fate had chosen to act as spokesman was indeed a fortunate circumstance to Miranda. Although the latter had applied himself assiduously to mastering the dialect of the West Coast carriers, he would have been hard put to it to carry on a conversation with one of them while he understood nothing of the Waziri tongue. Flora had schooled him carefully and well in the lore of Tarzan, so that he realized now that he was in the presence of a band of the ape-man's faithful Waziri. Never before had he seen such magnificent blacks, clean-cut, powerful men, with intelligent faces and well-molded features, appearing as much higher in the scale of evolution as were the West Coast blacks above the apes. Lucky indeed was Esteban Miranda that he was quick-witted and a consummate actor. Otherwise must he have betrayed his terror and his chagrin upon learning that this band of Tarzan's fierce and faithful followers was in this part of the country. For a moment longer he stood in silence before them, gathering his wits, and then he spoke, realizing that his very life depended upon his plausibility. And as he thought, a great light broke upon the shrewd brain of the unscrupulous Spaniard. "Since I last saw you," he said, "I discovered that a party of white men had entered the country for the purpose of robbing the treasure vaults of Opar. I followed them until I found their camp, and then I came in search of you. For there are many of them, and they have many ingots of gold, for they have already been to Opar. Follow me, and we will raid their camp and take the gold from them. Come." And he turned back toward the camp that he had just quitted. As they made their way along the jungle trail, Usula, the Waziri who had spoken English to him, walked at Esteban's side. Behind them, the Spaniard could hear the other warriors speaking in their native tongue, no word of which he understood, and it occurred to him that his position would be most embarrassing should he be addressed in the Waziri language, which, of course, Tarzan must have understood perfectly. As he listened to the chatter of Usula, his mind was working rapidly, and presently, as though it were an inspiration, there recurred to him the memory of an accident that had befallen Tarzan, which had been narrated to him by Flora. The story of the injury he had received in the treasure vaults of Opar upon the occasion that he had lost his memory because of a blow upon the head. Esteban wondered if he had committed himself too deeply at first to attribute to amnesia any shortcomings in the portrayal of the role he was acting. At its worst, however, it seemed to him the best that he could do. He turned suddenly upon Usula. "Do you remember," he asked, "the accident that befell me in the treasure vaults of Opar, depriving me of my memory?" "Yes, Bwana, I remember it well," replied the black. "A similar accident has befallen me," said Esteban. "A great tree fell in my path, and in falling a branch struck me upon the head. It has not caused me to lose my memory entirely, but since then it is with difficulty that I recall many things, and there are others which I must have forgotten entirely, for I do not know your name, nor do I understand the words that my other Waziri are speaking about me." Usula looked at him compassionately. "Ah, Bwana, sad indeed is the heart of Usula to hear that this accident has befallen you. Doubtless it will soon pass away, as did the other, and in the meantime, I, Ursula, will be your memory for you." "Good," said Esteban. "Tell the others that they may understand, and tell them also that I have lost the memory of other things besides. I could not now find my way home without you, and my other senses are dull as well. But as you say, Ursula, it will soon pass off, and I shall be myself again. Your faithful Waziri will rejoice indeed with the coming of that moment," said Ursula. As they approached the camp, Miranda cautioned Ursula to warn his followers to silence, and presently he halted them at the outskirts of the clearing, where they could attain a view of the boma and the tents, guarding which was a little band of a half-dozen askari. "When they see our greater numbers, they will make no resistance," said Esteban. "Let us surround the camp, therefore, and at a signal from me, we will advance together when you shall address them, saying that Tarzan of the Apes comes with his Waziri for the gold they have stolen, but that he will spare them if they will leave the country at once and never return." Had it fulfilled his purpose as well, the Spaniard would have willingly ordered his Waziri to fall upon the men guarding the camp and destroy them all. But to his cunning brain had been born a cleverer scheme. He wanted these men to see him with the Waziri and to live to tell the others that they had seen him, and to repeat to Flora and her followers the thing that Esteban had in his mind to tell one of the askari, while the Waziri were gathering up the gold ingots from the camp. In directing Ursula to station his men about the camp, Esteban had him warn them that they were not to show themselves until he had crept out into the clearing and attracted the attention of the askari on guard. 15 minutes, perhaps, were consumed in stationing his men, and then Ursula returned to Esteban to report that all was ready. "When I raise my hand, then you will know that they have recognized me and that you are to advance," Esteban cautioned him, and stepped forward slowly into the clearing. One of the askari saw him and recognized him as Esteban. The Spaniard took a few steps closer to the boma and then halted. "I am Tarzan of the Apes," he said. "Your camp is entirely surrounded by my warriors. Make no move against us, and we shall not hurt you." He waved his hand. 50 stalwart Waziris stepped into view from the concealing verdure of the surrounding jungle. The askari eyed them in ill-concealed terror, fingering their rifles nervously. "Do not shoot," cautioned Esteban, "or we shall slay you all." He approached more closely, and his Waziri closed in about him, entirely surrounding the boma. "Speak to them, Ursula," said Esteban. The black stepped forward. "We are the Waziri," he cried, "and this is Tarzan of the Apes, Lord of the Jungle, our master. We have come to recover the gold of Tarzan that you have stolen from the treasure vaults of Opar. This time we shall spare you on condition that you leave the country and never return. Tell this word to your masters. Tell them that Tarzan watches and that his Waziri watch with him. Lay down your rifles." The askari, glad to escape so easily, complied with the demands of Ursula, and a moment later the Waziri had entered the boma, and at Esteban's direction were gathering up the golden ingots. As they worked, Esteban approached one of the askari, whom he knew spoke broken English. "Tell your master," he said, "to give thanks for the mercy of Tarzan, who has exacted a toll of but one life for this invasion of his country and theft of his treasure. The creature who presumes to pose as Tarzan I have slain, and his body I shall take away with me and feed to the lions. Tell them that Tarzan forgives even their attempt to poison him upon the occasion that he visited their camp, but only upon the condition that they never return to Africa, and that they divulge the secret of Opar to no others. Tarzan watches, and his Waziri watch, and no man may enter Africa without Tarzan's knowledge. Even before they left London, I knew that they were coming. Tell them that." It took but a few minutes for the Waziri to gather up the golden ingots, and before the Askari had recovered from the surprise of their appearance, they had gone again into the jungle with Tarzan, their master. It was late in the afternoon before Flora and the four white men returned from their hunt, surrounded by happy, laughing blacks, bearing the fruits of a successful chase. "Now that you are in charge, Flora," Krasky was saying, "fortune is smiling upon us indeed. We have enough meat here for several days, and with plenty of meat in their bellies, they ought to make good progress." "I will say it myself, Dottings. Look brighter," said Bloober. "Blime, they do that," said Throck. "I'm telling you, Flora's a bright one." "What the devil is this?" demanded Peebles. "What's wrong with them beggars?" And he pointed toward the boma, which was now in sight, and from which the Askari were issuing at a run, jabbering excitedly as they raced toward them. "Tarzan of the Apes has been here," they cried excitedly. "He has been here with all his Waziri, 1,000 great warriors, and though we fought, they overcame us, and taking the gold, they went away. Tarzan of the Apes spoke strange words to me before they left. He said that he had killed one of your number, who had dared to call himself Tarzan of the Apes. We do not understand it. He went away alone to hunt when you went in the morning, and he came back shortly with 1,000 warriors, and he took all the gold, and he threatened to kill us and you if you ever return to this country again." What, cried Bloober. "The gold is gone. Oi, oi." And then they all commenced to ask questions at once, until Flora silenced them. "Come," she said, to the leader of the Askari. "We will return to the boma, and then you shall tell me slowly and carefully all that has happened since we left." She listened intently to his narrative, and then questioned him carefully upon various points several times. At last she dismissed him. Then she turned to her confederates. "It is all clear to me," she said. "Tarzan recovered from the effects of the drug we administered. Then he followed us with his Waziri, caught Esteban and killed him, and finding the camp, has taken the gold away. We shall be fortunate indeed if we escape from Africa with our lives." "Oi, oi," almost shrieked Bloober. "The dirty crook. He steals all our gold and will lose our 2,000 pounds into the bargain. Oi, oi." "Shut up, you dirty Jew," growled Throck. "If it hadn't have been for you and the Dago, this here thing would never have happened. With him a-bragging about his hunting and not being able to kill anything, and you a-squeezing every bloomin' halfpenny, we're in a rotten mess, that we are. This here Tarzan bounder, he bumped off Esteban, which is the best work what he ever done. Too bloody bad, you weren't here to get it too, and what I got a good mind to do is to slit your throat meself." "Stow the guff, Dick," roared Peebles. "It wasn't nobody's fault as far as I can see. Instead of talking, what we ought to do is to go after this 'ere Tarzan fella and take the bloomin' gold away from him." Flora Hawkes laughed. "We haven't a chance in the world," she said. "I know this Tarzan bloke. If he was all alone, we wouldn't be a match for him, but he's got a bunch of his Waziri with him, and there are no finer warriors in Africa than they, and they'd fight for him to the last man. You just tell Awaza that you're thinking of going after Tarzan of the Apes and his Waziri to take the gold away from them, and see how long it'd be before we wouldn't have a single nigger with us. The very name of Tarzan scares these West Coast blacks out of a year's growth. They would sooner face the devil. No, sir, we've lost, and all we can do is to get out of the country and thank our lucky stars if we manage to get out alive. The ape-man will watch us. I should not be surprised if he were watching us this minute." Her companions looked around apprehensively at this, casting nervous glances toward the jungle. "And he'd never let us get back to Opar for another load, even if we could prevail upon our blacks to return there." £2,000, £2,000, wailed Bloober. "On all this suit, what it cost me 20 guineas, what I can't wear it again in England unless I go to a fancy dress ball, which I never do." Krasky had not spoken, but had sat with eyes upon the ground, listening to the others. Now he raised his head. "We have lost our gold," he said, "and before we get back to England, we stand to spend the balance of our £2,000. In other words, our expedition is a total loss. The rest of you may be satisfied to go back broke, but I am not. There are other things in Africa besides the gold of Opar, and when we leave the country, there is no reason why we shouldn't take something with us that will repay us for our time and investment." "What do you mean?" asked Peebles. "I have spent a lot of time talking with Owaza," replied Krasky, "trying to learn their crazy language, and I have come to find out a lot about the old villain. He's as crooked as they make him, and if he were to be hanged for all his murders, he'd have to have more lives than a cat. But notwithstanding all that, he's a shrewd old fellow, and I've learned a lot more from him than just his monkey talk. I have learned enough, in fact, so that I feel safe in saying that if we stick together, we can go out of Africa with a pretty good-sized stake. Personally, I haven't given up the gold of Opar yet. What we've lost, but there's plenty left where that came from, and someday, after this blows over, I'm coming back to get my share." "But how about this other thing?" asked Flora. "How can Owaza help us?" "There's a little bunch of Arabs down here," explained Krasky, "stealing slaves and ivory. Owaza knows where they are working and where their main camp is. There are only a few of them, and their blacks are nearly all slaves who would turn on them in a minute. Now the idea is this: we have a big enough party to overpower them and take their ivory away from them if we can get their slaves to take our side. We don't want the slaves. We couldn't do anything with them if we had them, so we can promise them their freedom for their help and give Owaza and his gang a share in the ivory." "How do you know Owaza will help us?" asked Flora. "The idea is his. That's the reason I know," replied Krasky. "It sounds good to me," said Peebles. "I ain't for going home empty-handed." And in turn, the others signified their approval of the scheme. Chapter 11. Strange Incense Burns. As Tarzan carried the dead Bolgani from the village of the Gomangani, he set his steps in the direction of the building he had seen from the rim of the valley, the curiosity of the man overcoming the natural caution of the beast. He was traveling upwind, and the odors wafted down to his nostrils told him that he was approaching the habitat of the Bolgani. Intermingled with the scent spoor of the gorilla men was that of Gomangani, and the odor of cooked food, and the suggestion of a heavily sweet scent, which the ape-man could connect only with burning incense, though it seemed impossible that such a fragrance could emanate from the dwellings of the Bolgani. Perhaps it came from the great edifice he had seen, a building which must have been constructed by human beings, and in which human beings might still dwell, though never among the multitudinous odors that assailed his nostrils did he once catch the faintest suggestion of the man's scent of whites. When he perceived, from the increasing strength of their odor, that he was approaching close to the Bolgani, Tarzan took to the trees with his burden, that he might thus stand a better chance of avoiding discovery. And presently, through the foliage ahead, he saw a lofty wall, and beyond, the outlines of the weird architecture of a strange and mysterious pile. Outlines that suggested a building of another world, so unearthly were they. And from beyond the wall came the odor of the bolgani and the fragrance of the incense, intermingled with the scent spoor of Numa, the lion. The jungle was cleared away for 50 feet outside the wall surrounding the building, so that there was no tree overhanging the wall. But Tarzan approached as closely as he could, while still remaining reasonably well concealed by the foliage. He had chosen a point at a sufficient height above the ground to permit him to see over the top of the wall. The building within the enclosure was of great size, its different parts appearing to have been constructed at various periods and each with utter disregard to uniformity, resulting in a conglomeration of connecting buildings and towers, no two of which were alike, though the whole presented a rather pleasing, if somewhat bizarre, appearance. The building stood upon an artificial elevation about 10 feet high, surrounded by a retaining wall of granite, a wide staircase leading to the ground level below. About the building were shrubbery and trees, some of the latter appearing to be of great antiquity, while one enormous tower was almost entirely covered by ivy. By far the most remarkable feature of the building, however, lay in its rich and barbaric ornamentation. Set into the polished granite of which it was composed was an intricate mosaic of gold and diamonds. Glittering stones in countless thousands scintillated from facades, minarets, domes, and towers. The enclosure, which comprised some 15 or 20 acres, was occupied for the most part by the building. The terrace upon which it stood was devoted to walks, flowers, shrubs, and ornamental trees, while that part of the area below, which was within the range of Tarzan's vision, seemed to be given over to the raising of garden truck. In the garden and upon the terrace were naked blacks, such as he had seen in the village where he had left La. There were both men and women, and these were occupied with the care of growing things within the enclosure. Among them were several of the gorilla-like creatures such as Tarzan had slain in the village, but these performed no labor, devoting themselves, rather, it seemed, to directing the work of the blacks, toward whom their manner was haughty and domineering, sometimes even brutal. These gorilla men were trapped in rich ornaments similar to those upon the body, which now rested in a crotch of the tree behind the ape-man. As Tarzan watched with interest the scene below him, two bolgani emerged from the main entrance, a huge portal some 30 feet in width and perhaps 15 feet high. The two wore headbands supporting tall white feathers. As they emerged, they took post on either side of the entrance, and cupping their hands before their mouths gave voice to a series of shrill cries that bore a marked resemblance to trumpet calls. Immediately the blacks ceased work and hastened to the foot of the stairs, descending from the terrace to the garden. Here they formed lines on either side of the stairway, and similarly the bolgani formed two lines upon the terrace from the main portal to the stairway, forming a living aisle from one to the other. Presently, from the interior of the building came other trumpet-like calls, and a moment later Tarzan saw the head of a procession emerging. First came 4 bolgani abreast, each bedecked with an ornate feather headdress, and each carrying a huge bludgeon erect before him. Behind these came 2 trumpeters, and 20 feet behind the trumpeters paced a huge black-maned lion, held in leash by 4 sturdy blacks, 2 upon either side, holding what appeared to be golden chains that ran to a scintillant diamond collar about the beast's neck. Behind the lion marched 20 more bolgani, 4 abreast. These carried spears, but whether they were for the purpose of protecting the lion from the people or the people from the lion, Tarzan was at a loss to know. The attitude of the bolgani lining either side of the way between the portal and the stairway indicated extreme deference, for they bent their bodies from their waists in a profound bow while Numa was passing between their lines. When the beast reached the top of the stairway, the procession halted, and immediately the Gomangani ranged below, prostrated themselves, and placed their foreheads on the ground. Numa, who was evidently an old lion, stood with lordly mien, surveying the prostrate humans before him. His evil eyes glared glassily, the while he bared his tusks in a savage grimace, and from his deep lungs rumbled forth an ominous roar, at the sound of which the Gomangani trembled in unfeigned terror. The ape-man knit his brows in thought. Never before had he been called upon to witness so remarkable a scene of the abasement of man before a beast. Presently the procession continued upon its way, descending the staircase and turning to the right along a path through the garden. And when it had passed them, the Gomangani and the Bolgani arose and resumed their interrupted duties. Tarzan remained in his concealment watching them, trying to discover some explanation for the strange, paradoxical conditions that he had witnessed. The lion with his retinue had turned the far corner of the palace and disappeared from sight. What was he to these people, to these strange creatures? What did he represent? Why this topsy-turvy arrangement of species? Here man ranked lower than the half-beast, and above all, from the deference that had been accorded him, stood a true beast, a savage carnivore. He had been occupied with his thoughts and his observations for some 15 minutes, following the disappearance of Numa around the eastern end of the palace, when his attention was attracted to the opposite end of the structure by the sound of other shrill trumpet calls. Turning his eyes in that direction, he saw the procession emerging again into view, and proceeding toward the staircase down which they had entered the garden. Immediately the notes of the shrill call sounded upon their ears. The Gomangani and the Bolgani resumed their original positions from below the foot of the staircase to the entrance to the palace, and once again was homage paid to Numa as he made his triumphal entry into the building. Tarzan of the Apes ran his fingers through his mass of tousled hair, but finally he was forced to shake his head in defeat. He could find no explanation whatsoever for all that he had witnessed. His curiosity, however, was so keenly piqued that he determined to investigate the palace and surrounding grounds further before continuing on his way in search of a trail out of the valley. Leaving the body of Bolgani, where he had cached it, he started slowly to circle the building, that he might examine it from all sides from the concealing foliage of the surrounding forest. He found the architecture equally unique upon all sides, and that the garden extended entirely around the building, though a portion upon the south side of the palace was given over to corrals and pens in which were kept numerous goats and a considerable flock of chickens. Upon this side also were several hundred swinging beehive huts, such as he had seen in the native village of the Gomangani. These he took to be the quarters of the black slaves, who performed all the arduous and menial labor connected with the palace. The lofty granite wall which surrounded the entire enclosure was pierced by but a single gate, which opened opposite the east end of the palace. This gate was large and of massive construction, appearing to have been built to withstand the assault of numerous and well-armed forces. So strong did it appear that the ape-man could not but harbor the opinion that it had been constructed to protect the interior against forces equipped with heavy battering rams. That such a force had ever existed within the vicinity in historic times seemed most unlikely, and Tarzan conjectured, therefore, that the wall and the gate were of almost unthinkable antiquity, dating, doubtless, from the forgotten age of the Atlanteans, and constructed, perhaps, to protect the builders of the Palace of Diamonds from the well-armed forces that had come from Atlantis to work the gold mines of Opar and to colonize Central Africa. While the wall, the gate, and the palace itself suggested in many ways almost unbelievable age, yet they were in such an excellent state of repair that it was evident that they were still inhabited by rational and intelligent creatures. While, upon the south side, Tarzan had seen a new tower in process of construction, where a number of blacks, working under the direction of Bolgani, were cutting and shaping granite blocks and putting them in place. Tarzan had halted in a tree near the east gate to watch the life passing in and out of the palace grounds beneath the ancient portal, and as he watched, a long cavalcade of powerful Gomangani emerged from the forest and entered the enclosure. Swung in hides between two poles, this party was carrying rough-hewn blocks of granite, 4 men to a block. 2 or 3 Bolgani accompanied the long line of carriers, which was preceded and followed by a detachment of black warriors, armed with battle axes and spears. The demeanor and attitude of the black porters, as well as of the Bolgani, suggested to the ape-man nothing more nor less than a caravan of donkeys, plodding their stupid way at the behest of their drivers. If one lagged, he was prodded with the point of a spear, or struck with its haft. There was no greater brutality shown than in the ordinary handling of beasts of burden the world around, nor in the demeanor of the blacks was there any more indication of objection or revolt than you see depicted upon the faces of a long line of burden-bearing mules. To all intents and purposes, they were dumb, driven cattle. Slowly, they filed through the gateway and disappeared from sight. A few moments later, another party came out of the forest and passed into the palace grounds. This consisted of fully 50 armed Bolgani and twice as many black warriors with spears and axes. Entirely surrounded by these armed creatures were 4 brawny porters, carrying a small litter upon which was fastened an ornate chest about 2 feet wide by 4 feet long, with a depth of approximately 2 feet. The chest itself was of some dark, weather-worn wood, and was reinforced by bands and corners of what appeared to be virgin gold, in which were set many diamonds. What the chest contained Tarzan could not, of course, conceive, but that it was considered of great value was evidenced by the precautions for safety with which it had been surrounded. The chest was borne directly into the huge, ivy-covered tower at the northeast corner of the palace, the entrance to which Tarzan now first observed was secured by doors as large and heavy as the east gate itself. At the first opportunity that he could seize to accomplish it, undiscovered, Tarzan swung across the jungle trail and continued through the trees to that one in which he had left the body of the Bolgani. Throwing this across his shoulder, he returned to a point close above the trail near the east gate, and seizing upon a moment when there was a lull in the traffic, he hurled the body as close to the portal as possible. Now, thought the ape-man, let them guess who slew their fellow if they can. Making his way toward the southeast, Tarzan approached the mountains, which lie back of the Valley of the Palace of Diamonds. He had often to make detours to avoid native villages and to keep out of sight of the numerous parties of Bolgani that seemed to be moving in all directions through the forest. Late in the afternoon, he came out of the hills into full view of the mountains beyond. Rough granite hills they were, whose precipitous peaks arose far above the timberline. Directly before him, a well-marked trail led into a canyon, which he could see wound far upward toward the summit. This, then, would be as good a place to commence his investigations as another, and so, seeing that the coast was clear, the ape-man descended from the trees and, taking advantage of the underbrush bordering the trail, made his way silently yet swiftly into the hills. For the most part, he was compelled to worm his way through thickets, for the trail was in constant use by Gomangani and Bolgani, parties passing up it empty-handed and returning bearing blocks of granite. As he advanced more deeply into the hills, the heavy underbrush gave way to a lighter growth of scrub, through which he could pass with far greater ease, though with considerable more risk of discovery. However, the instinct of the beast that dominated Tarzan's jungle craft permitted him to find cover where another would have been in full view of every enemy. Halfway up the mountain, the trail passed through a narrow gorge, not more than 20 feet wide and eroded from solid granite cliffs. Here there was no concealment whatsoever, and the ape-man realized that to enter it would mean almost immediate discovery. Glancing about, he saw that by making a slight detour, he could reach the summit of the gorge, where, amid tumbled granite boulders and stunted trees and shrubs, he knew that he could find sufficient concealment and perhaps a plainer view of the trail beyond. Nor was he mistaken, for when he had reached a vantage point far above the trail, he saw ahead an open pocket in the mountain, the cliffs surrounding which were honeycombed with numerous openings, which, it seemed to Tarzan, could be naught else than the mouths of tunnels. Rough wooden ladders reached to some of them, closer to the base of the cliffs, while from others, knotted ropes dangled to the ground below. Out of these tunnels emerged men carrying little sacks of earth, which they dumped in a common pile beside a rivulet which ran through the gorge. Here other blacks, supervised by Bolgani, were engaged in washing the dirt, but what they hoped to find, or what they did find, Tarzan could not guess. Along one side of the rocky basin, many other blacks were engaged in quarrying the granite from the cliffs, which had been cut away through similar operations into a series of terraces running from the floor of the basin to the summit of the cliff. Here, naked blacks toiled with primitive tools under the supervision of savage Bolgani. The activities of the quarrymen were obvious enough, but what the others were bringing from the mouths of the tunnels, Tarzan could not be positive, though the natural assumption was that it was gold. Where then did they obtain their diamonds? Certainly not from these solid granite cliffs. A few minutes' observation convinced Tarzan that the trail he had followed from the forest ended in this little cul-de-sac, and so he sought a way upward and around it in search of a pass across the range. The balance of that day and nearly all the next he devoted to his efforts in this direction, only in the end to be forced to admit that there was no egress from the valley upon this side. To points far above the timberline he made his way, but there, always he came face to face with sheer, perpendicular cliffs of granite towering high above him, upon the face of which not even the ape-man could find foothold. Along the southern and eastern sides of the basin he carried his investigation, but with similar disappointing results, and then at last he turned his steps back toward the forest with the intention of seeking a way out through the valley of Opah with La, after darkness had fallen. The sun had just risen when Tarzan arrived at the native village in which he had left La, and no sooner did his eyes rest upon it than he became apprehensive that something was amiss, for not only was the gate wide open, but there was no sign of life within the palisade, nor was there any movement of the swinging huts that would indicate that they were occupied. Always wary of ambush, Tarzan reconnoitered carefully before descending into the village. To his trained observation, it became evident that the village had been deserted for at least 24 hours. Running to the hut, in which La had been hidden, he hastily ascended the rope and examined the interior. It was vacant, nor was there any sign of the high priestess. Descending to the ground, the ape-man started to make a thorough investigation of the village in search of clues to the fate of its inhabitants and of La. He had examined the interiors of several huts when his keen eyes noted a slight movement of one of the swinging, cage-like habitations some distance from him. Quickly, he crossed the intervening space, and as he approached the hut, he saw that no rope trailed from its doorway. Halting beneath, Tarzan raised his face to the aperture through which nothing but the roof of the hut was visible. "Gomangani," he cried, "it is I, Tarzan of the Apes. Come to the opening and tell me what has become of your fellows and of my mate, whom I left here under the protection of your warriors." There was no answer, and again Tarzan called, for he was positive that someone was hiding in the hut. "Come down," he called again, "or I will come up after you." Still there was no reply. A grim smile touched the ape-man's lips as he drew his hunting knife from its sheath and placed it between his teeth, and then, with a cat-like spring, leapt for the opening, and catching its sides, drew his body up into the interior of the hut. If he had expected opposition, he met with none, nor in the dimly lighted interior could he at first distinguish any presence, though, when his eyes became accustomed to the semi-darkness, he descried a bundle of leaves and grasses lying against the opposite wall of the structure. Crossing to these, he tore them aside, revealing the huddled form of a terrified woman. Seizing her by a shoulder, he drew her to a sitting position. "What has happened?" he demanded. "Where are the villagers? Where is my mate?" "Do not kill me! Do not kill me!" she cried. "It was not I. It was not my fault." "I do not intend to kill you," replied Tarzan. "Tell me the truth, and you shall be safe." "The Bolgani have taken them away," cried the woman. "They came when the sun was low upon the day that you arrived, and they were very angry, for they had found the body of their fellow outside the gate of the Palace of Diamonds. They knew that he had come here to our village, and no one had seen him alive since he had departed from the palace. They came then and threatened and tortured our people, until at last the warriors told them all. I hid. I do not know why they did not find me. But at last they went away, taking all the others with them, taking your mate too. They will never come back." "You think that the Bolgani will kill them?" asked Tarzan. "Yes," she replied. "They kill all who displease them." Alone now, and relieved of the responsibility of La, Tarzan might easily make his way by night through the valley of Opar and to safety beyond the barrier. But perhaps such a thought never entered his head. Gratitude and loyalty were marked characteristics of the ape-man. La had saved him from the fanaticism and intrigue of her people. She had saved him at a cost of all that was most dear to her: power and position, peace and safety. She had jeopardized her life for him and become an exile from her own country. The mere fact, then, that the Bolgani had taken her with the possible intention of slaying her was not sufficient for the ape-man. He must know whether or not she lived, and if she lived, he must devote his every energy to winning her release and her eventual escape from the dangers of this valley. Tarzan spent the day reconnoitering outside the palace grounds, seeking an opportunity of gaining entrance without detection, but this he found impossible, inasmuch as there was never a moment that there were not Gomangani or Bolgani in the outer garden. But with the approach of darkness, the great east gate was closed, and the inmates of the huts and palace withdrew within their walls, leaving not even a single sentinel without, a fact that indicated clearly that the Bolgani had no reason to apprehend an attack. The subjugation of the Gomangani, then, was apparently complete, and so the towering walls surrounding their palace, which was more than sufficient to protect them from the inroads of lions, was but the reminder of an ancient day when a once powerful, but now vanished, enemy threatened their peace and safety. When darkness had finally settled, Tarzan approached the gate, and throwing the noose of his grass rope over one of the carved lions that capped the gateposts, ascended quickly to the summit of the wall, from where he dropped lightly into the garden below. To ensure an avenue for quick escape in the event that he found La, he unlatched the heavy gates and swung them open. Then he crept stealthily toward the ivy-covered East Tower, which he had chosen, after a day of investigation, as offering easiest ingress to the palace. The success of his plan hinged largely upon the age and strength of the ivy, which grew almost to the summit of the tower, and to his immense relief, he found that it would easily support his weight. Far above the ground, near the summit of the tower, he had seen from the trees surrounding the palace an open window, which, unlike the balance of those in this part of the palace, was without bars. Dim lights shone from several of the tower windows, as from those of other parts of the palace. Avoiding these lighted apertures, Tarzan ascended quickly, though carefully, toward the unbarred window above, and as he reached it and cautiously raised his eyes above the level of the sill, he was delighted to find that it opened into an unlighted chamber, the interior of which, however, was so shrouded in darkness that he could discern nothing within. Drawing himself carefully to the level of the sill, he crept quietly into the apartment beyond. Groping through the blackness, he cautiously made the rounds of the room, which he found to contain a carved bedstead of peculiar design, a table, and a couple of benches. Upon the bedstead were stuffs of woven material, thrown over the softly tanned pelts of antelopes and leopards. Opposite the window through which he had entered was a closed door. This he opened slowly and silently, until, through a tiny aperture, he could look out upon a dimly lighted corridor or circular hallway, in the center of which was an opening about 4 feet in diameter, passing through which and disappearing beyond a similar opening in the ceiling directly above was a straight pole with short crosspieces fastened to it at intervals of about a foot, quite evidently the primitive staircase which gave communication between the various floors of the tower. 3 upright columns, set at equal intervals about the circumference of the circular opening in the center of the floor, helped to support the ceiling above. Around the outside of this circular hallway there were other doors, similar to that opening into the apartment in which he was. Hearing no noise and seeing no evidence of another than himself, Tarzan opened the door and stepped into the hallway. His nostrils were now assailed strongly by the same heavy fragrance of incense that had first greeted him upon his approach to the palace several days before. In the interior of the tower, however, it was much more powerful, practically obliterating all other odors, and placing upon the ape-man an almost prohibitive handicap in his search for La. In fact, as he viewed the doors upon this single stage of the tower, he was filled with consternation at the prospect of the well-nigh impossible task that confronted him. To search this great tower alone, without any assistance whatever from his keen sense of scent, seemed impossible of accomplishment if he were to take even the most ordinary precautions against detection. The ape-man's self-confidence was in no measure blundering egotism. Knowing his limitations, he knew that he would have little or no chance against even a few Bolgani, were he to be discovered within their palace, where all was familiar to them and strange to him. Behind him was the open window and the silent jungle night, and freedom, ahead danger, predestined failure, and quite likely death. Which should he choose? For a moment he stood in silent thought, and then raising his head and squaring his great shoulders, He shook his black locks defiantly and stepped boldly toward the nearest door. Room after room he had investigated until he had made the entire circle of the landing, but insofar as La, or any clue to her, were concerned, his search was fruitless. He found quaint furniture, and rugs and tapestries, and ornaments of gold and diamonds, and in one dimly lighted chamber he came upon a sleeping Bolgani, but so silent were the movements of the ape-man that the sleeper slept on undisturbed, even though Tarzan passed entirely around his bed, which was set in the center of the chamber, and investigated a curtained alcove beyond. Having completed the rounds of this floor, Tarzan determined to work upward first, and then, returning, investigate the lower stages later. Pursuant to this plan, therefore, he ascended the strange stairway. 3 landings he passed before he reached the upper floor of the tower. Circling each floor was a ring of doors, all of which were closed, while dimly lighting each landing were feebly burning cressets, shallow golden bowls, containing what appeared to be tallow, in which floated a tow-like wick. Upon the upper landing there were but 3 doors, all of which were closed. The ceiling of this hallway was the dome-like roof of the tower, in the center of which was another circular opening, through which the stairway protruded into the darkness of the night above. As Tarzan opened the door nearest him, it creaked upon its hinges, giving forth the first audible sound that had resulted from his investigations up to this point. The interior of the apartment before him was unlighted, and as Tarzan stood there in the entrance, in statuesque silence for a few seconds following the creaking of the hinge, he was suddenly aware of movement, of the faintest shadow of a sound, behind him. Wheeling quickly, he saw the figure of a man standing in an open doorway upon the opposite side of the landing. Chapter 12. The Golden Ingots. Esteban Miranda had played the role of Tarzan of the Apes with the Waziri as his audience for less than 24 hours, when he began to realize that, even with the leeway that his supposedly injured brain gave him, it was going to be a very difficult thing to carry on the deception indefinitely. In the first place, Ursula did not seem at all pleased at the idea of merely taking the gold away from the intruders and then running from them. Nor did his fellow warriors seem any more enthusiastic over the plan than he. As a matter of fact, they could not conceive that any number of bumps upon the head could render their Tarzan of the Apes a coward, and to run away from these West Coast blacks and a handful of inexperienced whites seemed nothing less than cowardly. Following all this, there had occurred in the afternoon that which finally decided the Spaniard that he was building for himself anything other than a bed of roses, and that the sooner he found an excuse for quitting the company of the Waziri, the greater would be his life expectancy. They were passing through rather open jungle at the time. The brush was not particularly heavy, and the trees were at considerable distances apart, when suddenly, without warning, a rhinoceros charged them. To the consternation of the Waziri, Tarzan of the Apes turned and fled for the nearest tree, the instant his eyes alighted upon charging Buto. In his haste, Esteban tripped and fell, and when at last he reached the tree, instead of leaping agilely into the lower branches, he attempted to shin up the huge bole as a schoolboy shins up a telegraph pole, only to slip and fall back again to the ground. In the meantime, Buto, who charges either by scent or hearing rather than by eyesight, his powers of which are extremely poor, had been distracted from his original direction by one of the Waziri, and after missing, the fellow had gone blundering on to disappear in the underbrush beyond. When Esteban finally arose and discovered that the rhinoceros was gone, he saw surrounding him a semicircle of huge blacks upon whose faces were written expressions of pity and sorrow, not unmingled, in some instances, with a tinge of contempt. The Spaniard saw that he had been terrified into a practically irreparable blunder, yet he seized despairingly upon the only excuse he could conjure up. "My poor head," he cried, pressing both palms to his temples. "The blow was upon your head, Bwana," said Ursula, "and your faithful Waziri thought that it was the heart of their master that knew no fear." Esteban made no reply, and in silence they resumed their march. In silence they continued until they made camp before dark upon the bank of the river just above a waterfall. During the afternoon, Esteban had evolved a plan of escape from his dilemma, and no sooner had he made camp than he ordered the Waziri to bury the treasure. "We shall leave it here," he said, "and tomorrow we shall set forth in search of the thieves, for I have decided to punish them. They must be taught that they may not come into the jungle of Tarzan with impunity. It was only the injury to my head that prevented me from slaying them. Immediately I discovered their perfidy." This attitude pleased the Waziri better. They commenced to see a ray of hope. Once again was Tarzan of the Apes becoming Tarzan. And so it was that with lighter hearts and a new cheerfulness, they set forth the next morning in search of the camp of the Englishmen. And by shrewd guessing on Ursula's part, they cut across the jungle to intercept the probable line of march of the Europeans to such advantage that they came upon them just as they were making camp that night. Long before they reached them, they smelled the smoke of their fires and heard the songs and chatter of the West Coast carriers. Then it was that Esteban gathered the Waziri about him. "My children," he said, addressing Ursula in English, "these strangers have come here to wrong Tarzan. To Tarzan, then, belongs the vengeance. Go, therefore, and leave me to punish my enemies alone and in my own way. Return home. Leave the gold where it is, for it will be a long time before I shall need it." The Waziri were disappointed, for this new plan did not at all accord with their desires, which contemplated a cheerful massacre of the West Coast blacks. But as yet, the man before them was Tarzan, their big Bwana, to whom they had never failed in implicit obedience. For a few moments following Esteban's declaration of his intention, they stood in silence, shifting uneasily, and then at last they commenced to speak to one another in Waziri. What they said the Spaniard did not know, but evidently they were urging something upon Ursula, who presently turned toward him. "Oh, Bwana," cried the black, "how can we return home to the Lady Jane and tell her that we left you injured and alone to face the rifles of the white men and their askari? Do not ask us to do it, Bwana. If you were yourself, we should not fear for your safety. But since the injury to your head, you have not been the same, and we fear to leave you alone in the jungle. Let us then, your faithful Waziri, punish these people, after which we will take you home in safety, where you may be cured of the evils that have fallen upon you." The Spaniard laughed. "I am entirely recovered," he said, "and I am in no more danger alone than I would be with you," which he knew, even better than they, was but a mild statement of the facts. "You will obey my wishes," he continued sternly. "Go back at once, the way that we have come. After you have gone at least 2 miles, you may make camp for the night, and in the morning start out again for home. Make no noise. I do not want them to know that I am here. Do not worry about me. I am all right, and I shall probably overtake you before you reach home. Go." Sorrowfully, the Waziri turned back upon the trail they had just covered, and a moment later, the last of them disappeared from the sight of the Spaniard. With a sigh of relief, Esteban Miranda turned toward the camp of his own people. fearing that to surprise them suddenly might invite a volley of shots from the askari, he whistled, and then called aloud as he approached. "It is Tarzan," cried the first of the blacks who saw him. "Now, indeed, shall we all be killed." Esteban saw the growing excitement among the carriers and askari. He saw the latter seize their rifles and that they were fingering the triggers nervously. "It is I, Esteban Miranda," he called aloud. "Flora, Flora, tell those fools to lay aside their rifles." The whites, too, were standing watching him, and at the sound of his voice, Flora turned toward the blacks. "It is all right," she said. "That is not Tarzan. Lay aside your rifles." Esteban entered the camp, smiling. "Here I am," he said. "We thought that you were dead," said Krasky. "Some of these fellows said that Tarzan said that he had killed you." "He captured me," said Esteban, "but as you see, he did not kill me. I thought that he was going to, but he did not, and finally he turned me loose in the jungle. He may have thought that I could not survive, and that he would accomplish his end just as surely without having my blood upon his hands." "He must have knowed you," said Peebles. "You'd die all right. If you were left alone very long in the jungle, you'd starve to death." Esteban made no reply to the sally, but turned toward Flora. "Are you not glad to see me, Flora?" he asked. The girl shrugged her shoulders. "What is the difference?" she asked. "Our expedition is a failure. Some of them think you were largely to blame." She nodded her head in the general direction of the other whites. The Spaniards scowled. None of them cared very much to see him. He did not care about the others, but he had hoped that Flora would show some enthusiasm about his return. Well, if she had known what he had in his mind, she might have been happier to see him, and only too glad to show some kind of affection. But she did not know. She did not know that Esteban Miranda had hidden the golden ingots where he might go another day and get them. It had been his intention to persuade her to desert the others, and then later the two would return and recover the treasure. But now he was piqued and offended. None of them should have a shilling of it. He would wait until they left Africa, and then he would return and take it all for himself. The only fly in the ointment was the thought that the Waziri knew the location of the treasure, and that sooner or later they would return with Tarzan and get it. This weak spot in his calculations must be strengthened, and to strengthen it, he must have assistance, which would mean sharing his secret with another. But whom? Outwardly oblivious of the sullen glances of his companions, he took his place among them. It was evident to him that they were far from being glad to see him, but just why he did not know, for he had not heard of the plan that Krasky and Awaza had hatched to steal the loot of the ivory raiders, and that their main objection to his presence was the fear that they would be compelled to share the loot with him. It was Krasky who first voiced the thought that was in the minds of all but Esteban. "Miranda," he said, "it is the consensus of opinion that you and Bluber are largely responsible for the failure of our venture. We are not finding fault. I just mention it as a fact. But since you have been away, we have struck upon a plan to take something out of Africa that will partially recompense us for the loss of the gold. We have worked the thing all out carefully and made our plans. We don't need you to carry them out. We have no objection to your coming along with us if you want to for company, but we want to have it understood from the beginning that you are not to share in anything that we get out of this." The Spaniard smiled and waved a gesture of unconcern. "It is perfectly all right," he said. "I shall ask for nothing. I would not wish to take anything from any of you." And he grinned inwardly as he thought of the more than £250,000 in gold which he would one day take out of Africa for himself, alone. At this unexpected attitude of acquiescence upon Esteban's part, the others were greatly relieved, and immediately the entire atmosphere of constraint was removed. "You're a good fellow, Esteban," said Peebles. "I've been saying right along that you'd want to do the right thing, and I want to say that I'm mighty glad to see you back here, safe and sound. I felt terrible when I heard you was croaked, that I did." "Yes," said Bloober. "John, he feels so bad he cry himself to sleep every night, ain't it, John?" "Don't try to start nothing, Bloober," growled Peebles, glaring at the Jew. "I wasn't commencing to start nodding," replied Adolf, seeing that the big Englishman was angry. "Of course, we were all sorry dat we thought Esteban was killed, and we is all glad dot he is back." "And that he don't want any of the swag," added Throck. "Don't worry," said Esteban. "If I get back to London, I'll be happy enough. I've had enough of Africa to last me all the rest of my life." Before he could get to sleep that night, the Spaniards spent a wakeful hour or two trying to evolve a plan whereby he might secure the gold absolutely to himself, without fear of its being removed by the Waziri later. He knew that he could easily find the spot where he had buried it and remove it to another close by, provided that he could return immediately over the trail along which Ursula had led them that day, and he could do this alone, ensuring that no one but himself would know the new location of the hiding place of the gold. But he was equally positive that he could never again return later from the coast and find where he had hidden it. This meant that he must share his secret with another, one familiar with the country, who could find the spot again at any time and from any direction. But who was there whom he might trust? In his mind, he went carefully over the entire personnel of their safari, and continually his mind reverted to a single individual, Awaza. He had no confidence in the wily old scoundrel's integrity, but there was no other who suited his purpose as well, and finally he was forced to the conclusion that he must share his secret with this black and depend upon avarice rather than honor for his protection. He could repay the fellow well, make him rich beyond his wildest dreams, and this the Spaniard could well afford to do in view of the tremendous fortune at stake. And so he fell asleep, dreaming of what gold, to the value of over £250,000 sterling, would accomplish in the gay capitals of the world. The following morning, while they were breakfasting, Esteban mentioned casually that he had passed a large herd of antelope not far from their camp the previous day, and suggested that he take 4 or 5 men and do a little hunting, joining the balance of the party at camp that night. No one raised any objection, possibly for the reason that they assumed that the more he hunted and the further from the safari he went, the greater the chances of his being killed, a contingency that none of them would have regretted, since at heart they had neither liking nor trust for him. "I will take Awaza," he said. "He is the cleverest hunter of them all, and 5 or 6 men of his choosing." But later, when he approached Awaza, the black interposed objections to the hunt. "We have plenty of meat for 2 days," he said. "Let us go on as fast as we can, away from the land of the Waziri and Tarzan. I can find plenty of game anywhere between here and the coast. March for 2 days, and then I will hunt with you." "Listen," said Esteban in a whisper, "it is more than antelope that I would hunt. I cannot tell you here in camp, but when we have left the others I will explain. It will pay you better to come with me today than all the ivory you can hope to get from the raiders." Awaza cocked an attentive ear and scratched his woolly head. "It is a good day to hunt, Bwana," he said. "I will come with you and bring 5 boys." After Awaza had planned the march for the main party and arranged for the camping place for the night so that he and the Spaniard could find them again, the hunting party set out upon the trail that Ursula had followed from the buried treasure the preceding day. They had not gone far before Awaza discovered the fresh spoor of the Waziri. "Many men passed here late yesterday," he said to Esteban, eyeing the Spaniard quizzically. "I saw nothing of them," replied the latter. "They must have come this way after I passed." "They came almost to our camp, and then they turned about and went away again," said Awaza. "Listen, Bwana, I carry a rifle, and you shall march ahead of me. If these tracks were made by your people, and you are leading me into ambush, you shall be the first to die." "Listen, Awaza," said Esteban, "we are far enough from camp now, so that I may tell you all. These tracks were made by the Waziri of Tarzan of the Apes, who buried the gold for me a day's march from here. I have sent them home, and I wish you to go back with me and move the gold to another hiding place. After these others have gotten their ivory and returned to England, you and I will come back and get the gold, and then indeed shall you be well rewarded." "Who are you then?" asked Awaza. "Often have I doubted that you are Tarzan of the Apes. The day that we left the camp outside of Opar, one of my men told me that you had been poisoned by your own people and left in the camp. He said that he saw it with his own eyes, your body lying hidden behind some bushes, and yet you were with us upon the march that day. I thought that he lied to me, but I saw the consternation in his face when he saw you, and so I have often wondered if there were two Tarzans of the Apes." "I am not Tarzan of the Apes," said Esteban. "It was Tarzan of the Apes who was poisoned in our camp by the others, but they only gave him something that would put him to sleep for a long time, possibly with the hope that he would be killed by wild animals before he awoke. Whether or not he still lives, we do not know. Therefore you have nothing to fear from the Waziri or Tarzan on my account, Awaza, for I want to keep out of their way even more than you." The black nodded. "Perhaps you speak the truth," he said, but still he walked behind, with his rifle always ready in his hand. They went warily, for fear of overtaking the Waziri, but shortly after passing the spot where the latter had camped, they saw that they had taken another route, and that there was now no danger of coming in contact with them. When they had reached a point within about a mile of the spot where the gold had been buried, Esteban told Awaza to have his boys remain there while they went ahead alone to effect the transfer of the ingots. "The fewer who know of this," he said to the black, "the safer we shall be." "The Bwana speaks words of wisdom," replied the wily black. Esteban found the spot near the waterfall without difficulty, and upon questioning Awaza, he discovered that the latter knew the location perfectly and would have no difficulty in coming directly to it again from the coast. They transferred the gold but a short distance, concealing it in a heavy thicket near the edge of the river, knowing that it would be as safe from discovery there as though they had transported it 100 miles, for the chances were extremely slight that the Waziri or anyone else who should learn of its original hiding place would imagine that anyone would go to the trouble of removing it but a matter of 100 yards. When they had finished, Awaza looked at the sun. "We will never reach camp tonight," he said, "and we will have to travel fast to overtake them even tomorrow." "I did not expect to," replied Esteban, "but I could not tell them that. If we never find them again, I shall be satisfied." Awaza grinned. In his crafty mind, an idea was formed. Why, he thought, risk death in a battle with the Arab ivory raiders on the chance of securing a few tusks when all this gold awaits only transportation to the coast to be ours? Chapter 13. A strange, flat tower. Tarzan, turning, discovered the man standing behind him on the top level of the ivy-covered east tower of the Palace of Diamonds. His knife leaped from its sheath at the touch of his quick fingers, but almost simultaneously His hand dropped to his side, and he stood contemplating the other, with an expression of incredulity upon his face that but reflected a similar emotion registered upon the countenance of the stranger. For what Tarzan saw was no Bolgani nor a Gomangani, but a white man, bald and old and shriveled, with a long white beard. A white man, naked but for barbaric ornaments of gold, spangles, and diamonds. "God!" exclaimed the strange apparition. Tarzan eyed the other quizzically. That single English word opened up such tremendous possibilities for conjecture as baffled the mind of the ape-man. "What are you? Who are you?" continued the old man, but this time in the dialect of the great apes. "You used an English word a moment ago," said Tarzan. "Do you speak that language?" Tarzan himself spoke in English. "Ah, dear God," cried the old man, "that I should have lived to hear that sweet tongue again." And he, too, now spoke in English, halting English, as might one who was long unaccustomed to voicing the language. "Who are you?" asked Tarzan, "and what are you doing here?" "It is the same question that I asked you," replied the old man. "Do not be afraid to answer me. You are evidently an Englishman, and you have nothing to fear from me." "I am here after a woman, captured by the Bolgani," replied Tarzan. The other nodded. "Yes," he said, "I know. She is here." "Is she safe?" asked Tarzan. "She has not been harmed. She will be safe until tomorrow or the next day," replied the old man. "But who are you, and how did you find your way here from the outer world?" "I am Tarzan of the Apes," replied the ape-man. "I came into this valley looking for a way out of the valley of Opar, where the life of my companion was in danger. And you?" "I am an old man," replied the other, "and I have been here ever since I was a boy. I was a stowaway on the ship that brought Stanley to Africa after the establishment of the station on Stanley Pool, and I came into the interior with him. I went out from camp to hunt, alone, one day. I lost my way and later was captured by unfriendly natives. They took me farther into the interior to their village, from which I finally escaped, but so utterly confused and lost that I had no idea what direction to take to find a trail to the coast. I wandered thus for months, until finally, upon an accursed day, I found an entrance to this valley. I do not know why they did not put me to death at once, but they did not, and later they discovered that my knowledge could be turned to advantage to them. Since then, I have helped them in their quarrying and mining and in their diamond cutting. I have given them iron drills with hardened points and drills tipped with diamonds. Now I am practically one of them, but always in my heart has been the hope that someday I might escape from the valley. A hopeless hope, though, I may assure you." "There is no way out?" asked Tarzan. "There is a way, but it is always guarded." "Where is it?" queried Tarzan. "It is a continuation of one of the mine tunnels, passing entirely through the mountain to the valley beyond. The mines have been worked by the ancestors of this race for an almost incalculable length of time. The mountains are honeycombed with their shafts and tunnels. Back of the gold-bearing quartz lies an enormous deposit of altered peridotite, which contains diamonds, in the search for which it evidently became necessary to extend one of the shafts to the opposite side of the mountain, possibly for purposes of ventilation. This tunnel and the trail leading down into Opar are the only means of ingress to the valley. From time immemorial, they have kept the tunnel guarded, more particularly, I imagine, to prevent the escape of slaves than to thwart the inroads of an enemy, since they believe that there is no fear of the latter emergency. The trail to Opar they do not guard because they no longer fear the Oparians and know quite well that none of their Gomangani slaves would dare enter the Valley of the Sun Worshippers. For the same reason, then, that the slaves cannot escape, we too must remain prisoners here forever. "How is the tunnel guarded?" asked Tarzan. "2 Bolgani and a dozen or more Gomangani warriors are always upon duty there," replied the old man. "The Gomangani would like to escape?" "They have tried it many times in the past, I am told," replied the old man, "though never since I have lived here, and always they were caught and tortured, and all their race was punished, and worked the harder because of these attempts upon the part of a few. They are numerous, the Gomangani." "There are probably 5,000 of them in the valley," replied the old man. "And how many Bolgani?" the ape-man asked. "Between 10 and 1,100. 5 to 1, murmured Tarzan. "And yet they are afraid to attempt to escape." "But you must remember," said the old man, "that the Bolgani are the dominant and intelligent race. The others are intellectually little above the beasts of the forest." "Yet they are men," Tarzan reminded him. "In figure only," replied the old man. "They cannot band together as men do. They have not as yet reached the community plane of evolution. It is true that families reside in a single village, but that idea, together with their weapons, was given to them by the Bolgani that they might not be entirely exterminated by the lions and panthers. Formerly, I am told, each individual Gomangani, when he became old enough to hunt for himself, constructed a hut apart from others and took up his solitary life, there being at that time no slightest semblance of family life. Then the Bolgani taught them how to build palisaded villages and compelled the men and women to remain in them and rear their children to maturity, after which the children were required to remain in the village, so that now some of the communities can claim as many as 40 or 50 people. But the death rate is high among them, and they cannot multiply as rapidly as people living under normal conditions of peace and security. The brutalities of the Bolgani kill many. The carnivora take a considerable toll. 5 to 1, and still they remain in slavery. What cowards they must be, said the ape-man. On the contrary, they are far from cowardly, replied the old man. They will face a lion with the utmost bravery. But for so many ages have they been subservient to the will of the Bolgani that it has become a fixed habit in them. As the fear of God is inherent in us, so is the fear of the Bolgani inherent in the minds of the Gomangani from birth. It is interesting, said Tarzan, but tell me now where the woman is of whom I have come in search. She is your mate? Asked the old man. No, replied Tarzan. I told the Gomangani that she was, so that they would protect her. She is La, Queen of Opar, High Priestess of the Flaming God. The old man looked his incredulity. Impossible, he cried. It cannot be that the Queen of Opar has risked her life by coming to the home of her hereditary enemies. She was forced to it, replied Tarzan, her life being threatened by a part of her people because she had refused to sacrifice me to their god. If the Bolgani knew this, there would be great rejoicing, replied the old man. Tell me where she is, demanded Tarzan. She preserved me from her people, and I must save her from whatever fate the Bolgani contemplate for her. It is hopeless, said the old man. I can tell you where she is, but you cannot rescue her. I can try, replied the ape-man, but you will fail and die. If what you tell me is true, that there is absolutely no chance of my escaping from the valley, I might as well die, replied the ape-man. However, I do not agree with you. The old man shrugged. You do not know the Bolgani, he said. Tell me where the woman is, said Tarzan. "Look," replied the old man, motioning Tarzan to follow him into his apartment, and approaching a window which faced toward the west, he pointed towards a strange, flat tower which rose above the roof of the main building near the west end of the palace. "She is probably somewhere in the interior of that tower," said the old man to Tarzan, "but as far as you are concerned, she might as well be at the North Pole." Tarzan stood in silence for a moment, his keen eyes taking in every salient detail of the prospect before him. He saw the strange, flat-topped tower, which it seemed to him might be reached from the roof of the main building. He saw two branches of the ancient trees that sometimes topped the roof itself, and except for the dim light shining through some of the palace windows, he saw no signs of life. He turned suddenly upon the old man. "I do not know you," he said, "but I believe that I may trust you, since after all, blood ties are strong, and we are the only men of our race in this valley. You might gain something in favor by betraying me, but I cannot believe that you will do it." "Do not fear," said the old man. "I hate them. If I could help you, I would, but I know that there is no hope of success. For whatever plan you may have in mind, the woman will never be rescued. You will never leave the Valley of the Palace of Diamonds. You will never leave the palace itself unless the Bolgani wish it." The ape-man grinned. "You have been here so long," he said, "that you are beginning to assume the attitude of mind that keeps the Gomangani in perpetual slavery. If you want to escape, come with me. We may not succeed, but at least you will have a better chance if you try than as if you remained forever in this tower." The old man shook his head. "No," he said, "it is hopeless. If escape had been possible, I should have been away from here long ago." "Goodbye, then," said Tarzan, and swinging out of the window, he clambered toward the roof below, along the stout stem of the old ivy. The old man watched him for a moment, until he saw him make his way carefully across the roof toward the flat-topped tower, where he hoped to find and liberate La. Then the old fellow turned and hurried rapidly down the crude stairway that rose ladder-like to the center of the tower. Tarzan made his way across the uneven roof of the main building, clambering up the sides of its higher elevations and dropping again to its lower levels as he covered a considerable distance between the east tower and that flat-topped structure of peculiar design in which La was supposed to be incarcerated. His progress was slow, for he moved with the caution of a beast of prey, stopping often in dense shadows to listen. When at last he reached the tower, he found that it had many openings letting upon the roof, openings which were closed only with hangings of the heavy tapestried stuff which he had seen in the tower. Drawing one of these slightly aside, he looked within upon a large chamber, bare of furnishings, from the center of which there protruded through a circular aperture the top of a stairway similar to that he had ascended in the east tower. There was no one in sight within the chamber, and Tarzan crossed immediately to the stairway. Peering cautiously into the opening, Tarzan saw that the stairway descended for a great distance, passing many floors. How far it went, he could not judge, except it seemed likely that it pierced subterranean chambers beneath the palace. Sounds of life came up to him through the shaft, and odors too, but the latter largely nullified, insofar as the scent impressions which they offered Tarzan were concerned, by the heavy incense which pervaded the entire palace. It was this perfume that was to prove the ape-man's undoing, for otherwise his keen nostrils would have detected the scent of a nearby Gomangani. The fellow lay behind one of the hangings at an aperture in the tower wall. He had been lying in such a position that he had seen Tarzan enter the chamber, and he was watching him now as the ape-man stood looking down the shaft of the stairway. The eyes of the black had at first gone wide in terror at sight of this strange apparition, the like of which he had never seen before. Had the creature been of sufficient intelligence to harbor superstition, he would have thought Tarzan a god descended from above. But being of too low an order to possess any imagination whatsoever, he merely knew that he saw a strange creature, and that all strange creatures must be enemies, he was convinced. His duty was to apprise his masters of this presence in the palace, but he did not dare to move until the apparition had reached a sufficient distance from him to ensure that the movements of the Gomangani would not be noticed by the intruder. He did not care to call attention to himself, for he had found that the more one effaced oneself in the presence of the Bolgani, the less one was likely to suffer. For a long time, the stranger peered down the shaft of the stairway, and for a long time, the Gomangani lay quietly watching him. But at last, the former descended the stairs and passed out of sight of the watcher, who immediately leaped to his feet and scurried away across the roof of the palace toward a large tower arising at its western end. As Tarzan descended the ladder, the fumes of the incense became more and more annoying. Where otherwise he might have investigated quickly by scent, he was now compelled to listen for every sound, and in many cases to investigate the chambers opening upon the central corridor by entering them. Where the doors were locked, he lay flat and listened close to the aperture at their base. On several occasions, he risked calling La by name, but in no case did he receive any reply. He had investigated 4 landings and was descending to the 5th, when he saw standing in one of the doorways upon this level an evidently much excited and possibly terrified black. The fellow was of giant proportions and entirely unarmed. He stood looking at the ape-man with wide eyes as the latter jumped lightly from the stairway and stood facing him upon the same level. "What do you want?" finally stammered the black. "Are you looking for the white she, your mate, whom the Bolgani took?" "Yes," replied Tarzan. "What do you know of her?" "I know where she is hidden," replied the black, "and if you will follow me, I will lead you to her." "Why do you offer to do this for me?" asked Tarzan, immediately suspicious. "Why is it that you do not go at once to your masters and tell them that I am here, that they may send men to capture me?" "I do not know the reason that I was sent to tell you this," replied the black. "The Bolgani sent me. I did not wish to come, for I was afraid." "Where did they tell you to lead me?" asked Tarzan. "I am to lead you into a chamber, the door of which will be immediately bolted upon us. You will then be a prisoner." "And you?" inquired Tarzan. "I, too, shall be a prisoner with you. The Bolgani do not care what becomes of me. Perhaps you will kill me, but they do not care." "If you lead me into a trap, I shall kill you," replied Tarzan. "But if you lead me to the woman, perhaps we shall all escape. You would like to escape, would you not?" "I should like to escape, but I cannot." "Have you ever tried?" "No, I have not. Why should I try to do something that cannot be done?" "If you lead me into the trap, I shall surely kill you. If you lead me to the woman, you at least have the chance that I do to live. Which will you do?" The black scratched his head in thought, the idea slowly filtering through his stupid mind. At last he spoke. "You are very wise," he said. "I will lead you to the woman." "Go ahead, then," said Tarzan, "and I will follow you." The black descended to the next level and, opening the door, entered a long, straight corridor. As the ape-man followed his guide, he had leisure to reflect upon the means through which the Bolgani had learned of his presence in the tower, and the only conclusion he could arrive at was that the old man had betrayed him, since in so far as Tarzan was aware, he alone knew that the ape-man was in the palace. The corridor along which the black was leading him was very dark, receiving a dim and inadequate illumination from the dimly lighted corridor they had just left, the door into which remained open behind them. Presently the black stopped before a closed door. "The woman is in there," said the black, pointing to the door. "She is alone?" asked Tarzan. "No," replied the black. "Look," and he opened the door, revealing a heavy hanging, which he gently separated, revealing to Tarzan the interior of the chamber beyond. Seizing the black by the wrist that he might not escape, Tarzan stepped forward and put his eyes to the aperture. Before him lay a large chamber, at one end of which was a raised dais, the base of which was of a dark, ornately carved wood. The central figure upon this dais was a huge, black-maned lion, the same that Tarzan had seen escorted through the gardens of the palace. His golden chains were now fastened to rings in the floor, while the four blacks stood in statuesque rigidity, two upon either side of the beast. Upon golden thrones behind the lion sat three magnificently ornamented Bolgani. At the foot of the steps leading to the stair stood La, between two Gomangani guards. Upon either side of a central aisle were carved benches facing the dais, and occupying the front section of these were some 50 Bolgani, among whom Tarzan almost immediately espied the little old man that he had met in the tower, the sight of whom instantly crystallized the ape-man's conviction of the source of his betrayal. The chamber was lighted by hundreds of cressets, burning a substance which gave forth both light and the heavy incense that had assailed Tarzan's nostrils since first he entered the domain of the Bolgani. The long cathedral-esque windows upon one side of the apartment were thrown wide, admitting the soft air of the jungle summer night. Through them Tarzan could see the palace grounds, and that this chamber was upon the same level as the terrace upon which the palace stood. Beyond those windows was an open gateway to the jungle and freedom, but interposed between him and the windows were 50 armed guerrilla men. Perhaps, then, strategy would be a better weapon than force with which to carve his way to freedom with La. Yet to the forefront of his mind was evidently a belief in the probability that in the end it would be force rather than strategy upon which he must depend. He turned to the black at his side. Would the Gomangani guarding the lion like to escape from the Bolgani? He asked. The Gomangani would all escape if they could, replied the black. If it is necessary for me to enter the room, then, said Tarzan to the black, will you accompany me and tell the other Gomangani that if they will fight for me, I will take them out of the valley? I will tell them, but they will not believe, replied the black. Tell them that they will die if they do not help me then, said Tarzan. I will tell them. As Tarzan turned his attention again to the chamber before him, he saw that the Bolgani occupying the central golden throne was speaking. Nobles of Numa, king of beasts, emperor of all created things, he said in deep growling tones. Numa has heard the words that this she has spoken, and it is the will of Numa that she die. The great emperor is hungry. He himself will devour her here in the presence of his nobles and the imperial council of three. It is the will of Numa. A growl of approval arose from the beast-like audience, while the great lion bared his hideous fangs and roared until the palace trembled, his wicked yellow-green eyes fixed terribly upon the woman before him, evidencing the fact that these ceremonies were of sufficient frequency to have accustomed the lion to what he might expect as the logical termination of them. Day after tomorrow, continued the speaker, the mate of this creature, who is by this time safely imprisoned in the Tower of the Emperors, will be brought before Numa for judgment. Slaves, he cried suddenly in a loud voice, rising to his feet and glaring at the guards holding La. Drag the woman to your emperor." Instantly the lion became frantic, lashing its tail and straining at its stout chains, roaring and snarling as it reared upon its hind feet and sought to leap upon La, who was now being forcibly conducted up the steps of the dais, toward the bejeweled man-eater, so impatiently awaiting her. She did not cry out in terror, but she sought to twist herself free from the detaining hands of the powerful Gomangani, all futilely, however. They had reached the last step and were about to push La into the claws of the lion when they were arrested by a loud cry from one side of the chamber, a cry that halted the Gomangani and brought the assembled Bolgani to their feet in astonishment and anger, for the sight that met their eyes was well qualified to arouse the latter within them. Leaping into the room with raised spear was the almost naked white man of whom they had heard, but whom none of them had as yet seen. And so quick was he that in the very instant of entry, even before they could rise to their feet, he had launched his spear. Chapter 14. The Chamber of Horrors. A black-maned lion moved through the jungle night. With majestic unconcern for all other created things, he took his lordly way through the primeval forest. He was not hunting, for he made no efforts towards stealth, nor, on the other hand, did he utter any vocal sound. He moved swiftly, though sometimes stopping with uplifted nose to scent the air and to listen. And thus at last he came to a high wall, along the face of which he sniffed, until the wall was broken by a half-opened gateway, through which he passed into the enclosure. Before him loomed a great building, and presently, as he stood, watching it and listening, there broke from the interior the thunderous roar of an angry lion. He of the black mane cocked his head upon one side and moved stealthily forward. At the very instant that La was about to be thrust into the clutches of Numa, Tarzan of the apes leaped into the apartment with a loud cry that brought to momentary pause the Gomangani that were dragging her to her doom. And in that brief instant of respite which the ape-man knew would follow his interruption, the swift spear was launched. To the rage and consternation of the Bolgani, they saw it bury itself in the heart of their emperor, the great black-maned lion. At Tarzan's side stood the Gomangani whom he had terrified into service, and as Tarzan rushed forward toward La, the black accompanied him, crying to his fellows that if they would help this stranger, they might be free and escape from the Bolgani forever. "You have permitted the great emperor to be slain," he cried to the poor Gomangani who guarded Numa. "For this the Bolgani will kill you. Help to save the strange Tarmangani and his mate, and you have at least a chance for life and freedom. And you," he added, addressing the two who had been guarding La, "they will hold you responsible also. Your only hope lies with us." Tarzan had reached at La's side and was dragging her up the steps of the dais, where he hoped that he might make a momentary stand against the 50 Bolgani who were now rushing forward from their seats toward him. "Slay the 3 who sit upon the dais," cried Tarzan to the Gomangani, who were now evidently hesitating as to which side they would cast their lot with. "Slay them if you wish your freedom. Slay them if you wish to live." The authoritative tones of his voice, the magnetic appeal of his personality, his natural leadership won them to him for the brief instant that was necessary to turn them upon the hated authority that the 3 Bolgani upon the dais represented, and as they drove their spears into the shaggy black bodies of their masters, they became then and forever the creatures of Tarzan of the apes, for there could be no future hope for them in the land of the Bolgani. With one arm around La's waist, the ape-man carried her to the summit of the dais, where he seized his spear and drew it from the body of the dead lion. Then, turning about and facing the advancing Bolgani, he placed one foot upon the carcass of his kill and raised his voice in the terrifying victory cry of the apes of Kerchak. Before him, the Bolgani paused. Behind him, the Gomangani quailed in terror. "Stop!" cried Tarzan, raising a palm toward the Bolgani. "Listen, I am Tarzan of the apes. I sought no quarrel with your people. I but look for a passage through your country to my own. Let me go my way in peace with this woman, taking these Gomangani with me." For answer, a chorus of savage growls arose from the Bolgani as they started forward again toward the dais. From their ranks, there suddenly leapt the old man of the East Tower, who ran swiftly toward Tarzan. "Ah, traitor!" cried the ape-man. "You would be the first, then, to taste the wrath of Tarzan?" He spoke in English, and the old man replied ill the same tongue. "Traitor!" he exclaimed in surprise. "Yes, traitor," thundered Tarzan. "Did you not hurry here to tell the Bolgani that I was in the palace, that they might send the Gomangani to lure me to a trap?" "I did nothing of the kind," replied the other. "I came here to place myself near the white woman, with the thought that I might be of service to her or you if I were needed. I come now, Englishman, to stand at your side and die at your side, for die you shall, as sure as there is a God in heaven. Nothing can save you now from the wrath of the Bolgani, whose emperor you have killed." "Come then," cried Tarzan, "and prove your loyalty. It were better to die now than to live in slavery forever." The 6 Gomangani had ranged themselves, 3 upon either side of Tarzan and La, while the 7th, who had entered the chamber with Tarzan unarmed, was taking weapons from the body of one of the 3 Bolgani who had been slain upon the dais. Before this array of force so new to them, the Bolgani paused at the foot of the steps leading to the dais. But only for a moment they paused, for there were but 9 against 50, and as they surged up the steps, Tarzan and his Gomangani met them with battle-axe and spear and bludgeon. For a moment they pressed them back, but the numbers against them were too great, and once again a wave swept up that seemed likely to overwhelm them, when there broke upon the ears of the contestants a frightful roar, which, coming from almost at their sides, brought a sudden, momentary cessation of the battle. Turning their eyes in the direction of the sound, they saw a huge, black-maned lion standing upon the floor of the apartment just within one of the windows. For an instant he stood like a statue of golden bronze, and then again the building trembled to the reverberations of his mighty roar. Towering above them all, Tarzan of the Apes looked down from the dais upon the great beast below him, and then in quick elation he raised his voice above the growlings of the Bolgani. "Jad-bal-ja!" he cried, and pointing toward the Bolgani, "Kill! Kill!" Scarcely had the words been uttered ere the huge monster, a veritable devil incarnate, was upon the hairy gorilla men, and simultaneously there occurred to the mind of the ape-man a daring plan of salvation for himself and the others who were dependent upon him. "Quick!" he cried to the Gomangani, "fall upon the Bolgani. Here at last is the true Numa, king of beasts and ruler of all creation. He slays his enemies, but he will protect Tarzan of the Apes and the Gomangani, who are his friends." Seeing their hated masters falling back before the terrific onslaughts of the lion, the Gomangani rushed in with battle-axes and clubs, while Tarzan, casting aside his spear, took his place among them with drawn knife, and keeping close to Jad-bal-ja, directed the lion from one victim to another, lest he fall by mistake upon the Gomangani or the little old white man, or even La herself. 20 of the Bolgani lay dead upon the floor before the balance managed to escape from the chamber, and then Tarzan, turning to Jad-bal-ja, called him to heel. "Go," he said, turning toward the Gomangani, "and drag the body of the false Numa from the dais. Remove it from the room, for the true emperor has come to claim his throne." The old man and La were eyeing Tarzan and the lion in amazement. "Who are you," asked the former, "that you can work such miracles with a savage beast of the jungle? Who are you, and what do you intend to do?" "Wait and see," said Tarzan with a grim smile. "I think that we shall all be safe now, and that the Gomangani may live in comfort for a long time hereafter." When the blacks had removed the carcass of the lion from the dais and thrown it from one of the windows of the chamber, Tarzan sent Jad-bal-ja to sit in the place upon the dais that had formerly been occupied by the lion Numa. "There," he said, turning to the Gomangani, "you see the true emperor, who does not have to be chained to his throne. 3 of you will go to the huts of your people behind the palace and summon them to the throne room, that they too may see what has transpired. Hurry, that we may have many warriors here before the Bolgani return in force." Filled with an excitement which almost shook their dull minds into a semblance of intelligence, 3 of the Gomangani hastened to do Tarzan's bidding, while the others stood gazing at Tarzan with expressions of such awe that might only be engendered by the sight of deity. Lay came then and stood beside Tarzan, looking up into his face with eyes that reflected a reverence fully as deep as that held by the blacks. "I have not thanked you, Tarzan of the Apes," she said, "for what you have risked and done for me. I know that you must have come here in search of me, to save me from these creatures, and I know that it was not love that impelled you to this heroic and well-nigh hopeless act. That you have succeeded thus far is little short of miraculous, but I, in the legends of whose people are recounted the exploits of the Bolgani, know that there can be no hope of eventual escape for us all, and so I beseech that you go at once and make good your escape alone, if possible, for you alone of us have any possible chance of escape." "I do not agree with you that we have no chance to escape, La," replied the ape-man. "It seems to me that now we not only have every reason to believe that we are practically assured of escape, but that we may ensure also to these poor Gomangani freedom from slavery and from the tyranny of the Bolgani. But this is not all. With this, I shall not be satisfied. Not only must these people who show no hospitality to strangers be punished, but your own disloyal priests as well. To this latter end, I intend to march out of the valley of the Palace of Diamonds, down upon the city of Opar with a force of Gomangani sufficient to compel Kaj to relinquish the power he has usurped and replace you upon the throne of Opar. Nothing less than this shall satisfy me, and nothing less than this shall I accomplish before I leave." "You are a brave man," said the old man, "and you have succeeded beyond what I thought could be possible. But La is right, you do not know the ferocity or the resources of the Bolgani or the power which they wield over the Gomangani. Could you raise from the stupid minds of the blacks the incubus of fear that rests so heavily upon them, you might win over a sufficient number to make good your escape from the valley, but that, I fear, is beyond even you. Our only hope, therefore, is to escape from the palace while they are momentarily disorganized, and trust to fleetness and to luck to carry us beyond the limits of the valley before we are apprehended." "See," cried La, pointing, "even now it is too late. They return." Tarzan looked in the direction that she indicated and saw through the open doorway at the far end of the chamber a large number of gorilla men approaching. His eyes moved swiftly to the windows in the other wall. "But wait," he said, "behold, another factor in the equation. The others looked toward the windows, which opened upon the terrace, and they saw beyond them what appeared to be a crowd of several hundred blacks running rapidly toward the windows. The other blacks upon the dais cried out excitedly, "They come! They come! We shall be free, and no longer shall the Bolgani be able to make us work, until we drop from exhaustion, or beat us, or torture us, or feed us to Numa." As the first of the Bolgani reached the doorway leading into the chamber, the Gomangani commenced to pour through the several windows in the opposite wall. They were led by the three who had been sent to fetch them, and to such good effect had these carried their message that the blacks already seemed like a new people, so transfigured were they by the thought of immediate freedom. At sight of them, the leader of the Bolgani cried aloud for them to seize the intruders upon the dais, but his answer was a spear hurled by the nearest black, and as he lunged forward, dead, the battle was on. The Bolgani in the palace greatly outnumbered the blacks, but the latter had the advantage of holding the interior of the throne room in sufficient numbers to prevent the entry of many Bolgani simultaneously. Tarzan, immediately he recognized the temper of the blacks, called Jad-bal-ja to follow him, and descending from the dais, he took command of the Gomangani. At each opening he placed sufficient men to guard it, and at the center of the room he held the balance in reserve. Then he called the old man into consultation. "The gate in the east wall is open," he said. "I left it so when I entered. Would it be possible for 20 or 30 blacks to reach it in safety, and entering the forest, carry word to the villagers of what is transpiring here in the palace, and prevail upon them to send all of their warriors immediately to complete the work of emancipation that we have begun?" "It is an excellent plan," replied the old man. "The Bolgani are not upon that side of the palace between us and the gate, and if it may ever be accomplished, now is the time. I will pick your men for you. They must be headmen, whose words will carry some weight with the villagers outside the palace walls." "Good," exclaimed Tarzan. "Select them immediately. Tell them what we want, and urge upon them the necessity for haste." One by one the old man chose 30 warriors, whose duty he carefully explained to each. They were delighted with the plan, and assured Tarzan that in less than an hour the first of the reinforcements would come. "As you leave the enclosure," said the ape-man, "destroy the lock if you can, so that the Bolgani may not lock it again, and bar out our reinforcements. Carry also the word that the first who come are to remain outside the wall until a sufficient number have arrived to make entry into the palace grounds reasonably safe, at least as many as are within this room now." The blacks signified their understanding, and a moment later passed out of the room through one of the windows, and disappeared into the darkness of the night beyond. Shortly after the blacks had left, the Bolgani made a determined rush upon the Gomangani guarding the main entrance to the throne room, with the result that a score or more of the guerrilla men succeeded in cutting their way into the room. At this first indication of reversal, the blacks showed signs of faltering, the fear of the Bolgani that was inherent in them showing in their wavering attitude and seeming reluctance to force a counterattack. As Tarzan leaped forward to assist in checking the rush of the Bolgani into the throne room, he called to Jad-bal-ja, and as the great lion leaped from the dais, the ape-man, pointing to the nearest Bolgani, cried, "Kill! Kill!" Straight for the throat of the nearest leaped Jad-bal-ja. The great jaws closed upon the snarling face of the frightened gorilla man. But once, and then, at the command of his master, the golden lion dropped the carcass after a single shake and leaped upon another. 3 had died thus in quick succession when the balance of the Bolgani turned to flee this chamber of horrors. But the Gomangani, their confidence restored by the ease with which this fierce ally brought death and terror to the tyrants, interposed themselves between the Bolgani and the doorway, shutting off their retreat. "Hold them! Hold them!" cried Tarzan. "Do not kill them." And then to the Bolgani, "Surrender, and you will not be harmed." Jad-bal-ja clung close to the side of his master, glaring and growling at the Bolgani, and casting an occasional beseeching look at the ape-man, which said plainer than words, "Send me among them." 15 of the Bolgani who had entered the room survived. For a moment they hesitated, and then one of them threw his weapons upon the floor. Immediately, the others followed suit. Tarzan turned toward Jad-bal-ja. "Back," he said, pointing toward the dais, and as the lion wheeled and slunk away toward the platform, Tarzan turned again toward the Bolgani. "Let one of your number go," he said, "and announce to your fellows that I demand their immediate surrender." The Bolgani whispered among themselves for a few moments, and finally one of them announced that he would go and see the others. After he had left the room, the old man approached Tarzan. "They will never surrender," he said. "Look out for treachery." "It is all right," said Tarzan. "I am expecting that, but I am gaining time, and that is what we need most. If there were a place near where I might confine these others, I should feel better, for it would cut down our antagonists by at least that many." "There is a room there," said the old man, pointing toward one of the doorways in the throne room, "where you can confine them. There are many such rooms in the Tower of the Emperors." "Good," said Tarzan, and a moment later, following his instructions, the Bolgani were safely locked in a room adjoining the throne room. In the corridors without, they could hear the main body of the gorilla men in argument. It was evident that they were discussing the message sent to them by Tarzan. 15 minutes passed, and finally 30, with no word from the Bolgani and no resumption of hostilities. And then there came to the main entrance of the throne room the fellow whom Tarzan had dispatched with his demand for surrender. "Well," asked the ape-man, "what is their answer?" "They will not surrender," replied the Bolgani, "but they will permit you to leave the valley provided that you will release those whom you have taken prisoner and harm no others." The ape-man shook his head. "That will not do," he replied. "I hold the power to crush the Bolgani of the Valley of Diamonds. Look," and he pointed toward Jad-bal-ja. "Here is the true Numa. The creature you had upon your throne was but a wild beast, but this is Numa, king of beasts, emperor of all created things. Look at him. Must he be held in leash by golden chains like some prisoner or slave? No, he is indeed an emperor, but there is one yet greater than he, one from whom he takes commands, and that one is I, Tarzan of the Apes. Anger me, and you shall feel not only the wrath of Numa, but the wrath of Tarzan as well. The Gomangani are my people, the Bolgani shall be my slaves. Go and tell your fellows that, and that if they would live at all, they had best come soon and sue for mercy. Go." When the messenger had again departed, Tarzan looked at the old man, who was eyeing him with an expression which might have denoted either awe or reverence, were it not for the vaguest hint of a twinkle in the corners of the eyes. The ape-man breathed a deep sigh of relief. "That will give us at least another half-hour," he said. "We shall need it, and more too," replied the old man, "though at that you have accomplished more than I had thought possible, for at least you have put a doubt in the minds of the Bolgani, who never before have had cause to question their own power." Presently, from the outer corridors, the sounds of argument and discussion gave place to that of movement among the Bolgani. A company, comprising some 50 of the gorilla men, took post directly outside the main entrance of the throne room, where they stood in silence, their weapons ready, as though for the purpose of disputing any effort upon the part of the inmates of the room to escape. Beyond them, the balance of the gorilla men could be seen moving away and disappearing through doorways and corridors leading from the main hallway of the palace. The Gomangani, together with La and the old man, watched impatiently for the coming of the black reinforcements, while Tarzan sat upon the edge of the dais, half reclining, with an arm about the neck of Jad-bal-ja. "They are up to something," said the old man. "We must watch carefully against a surprise. If the blacks would but come now, while the doorway is held by only 50, we should overcome them easily and have, I do verily believe, some slight chance of escaping from the palace grounds." "Your long residence here," said Tarzan, "has filled you with the same senseless fear of the Bolgani that the Gomangani hold. From the attitude of mind which you hold toward them, one would think them some manner of supermen. They are only beasts, my friend, and if we remain loyal to our cause, we shall overcome them." "Beasts they may be," replied the old man, "but they are beasts with the brains of men. Their cunning and their cruelty are diabolical." A long silence ensued, broken only by the nervous whisperings of the Gomangani, whose morale, it was evident, was slowly disintegrating under the nervous strain of the enforced wait, and the failure of their fellows of the forest to come quickly to their aid. To this was added the demoralizing effect of speculation upon what the Bolgani were planning or what plan they already were putting into effect. The very silence of the gorilla men was more terrible than the din of actual assault. La was the first of the whites to break the silence. "If 30 of the Gomangani could leave the palace so easily, why might not we leave also?" she asked. "There were two reasons," replied Tarzan. "One was that, should we have left simultaneously, the Bolgani, greatly outnumbering us as they did, could have harassed us and detained us for a sufficient length of time to have permitted their messengers to reach the villages ahead of us, with the result that in a short time we should have been surrounded by thousands of hostile warriors. The second reason is that I desire to punish the creatures, so that in future a stranger may be safe in the Valley of the Palace of Diamonds." He paused. "And now I shall give you a third reason why we may not seek to escape at this moment." He pointed toward the windows overlooking the terrace. "Look," he said, "the terrace and the gardens are filled with Bolgani. Whatever their plan, I think its success depends upon our attempt to escape from this room through the windows, for, unless I am mistaken, the Bolgani upon the terrace and in the gardens are making an attempt to hide themselves from us." The old man walked to a part of the room from which he could see the greater part of the terrace and gardens upon which the windows of the throne room looked. "You are right," he said, when he returned to the ape-man's side. "The Bolgani are all massed outside these windows, with the exception of those who guard the entrance, and possibly some others at the doorways at other portions of the throne room. That, however, we must determine." He walked quickly to the opposite side of the chamber and drew back the hangings before one of the apertures, disclosing beyond a small band of Bolgani. They stood there, motionless, not making any effort to seize or harm him. To another exit and another he went, and beyond each discovered to the occupants of the chamber the same silent guerrilla guardians. He made the circle of the room, passing over the dais behind the three thrones, and then he came back to Tarzan and La. "It is as I suspected," he said. "We are entirely surrounded. Unless help comes soon, we are lost." "But their force is divided," Tarzan reminded him. "Even so, it is sufficient to account for us," replied the old man. "Perhaps you are right," said Tarzan, "but at least we shall have a bully fight." "What is that?" exclaimed La, and simultaneously, attracted by the same noise, the inmates of the throne room raised their eyes to the ceiling above them, where they saw that traps had been lifted from a dozen openings, revealing the scowling faces of several score of gorilla men. "What are they up to now?" exclaimed Tarzan, and as though in answer to the query, the Bolgani above began hurling bundles of burning, oil-soaked rags tied in goat skins into the throne room, which immediately commenced to fill it with a thick, suffocating smoke, accompanied by the stench of burning hide and hair. Chapter 15. The Map of Blood. After Esteban and Awaza had buried the gold, they returned to the spot where they had left their 5 boys, and proceeding with them to the river, made camp for the night. Here they discussed their plans, deciding to abandon the balance of the party to reach the coast as best they might, while they returned to another section of the coast where they could recruit sufficient porters to carry out the gold. "Instead of going way back to the coast for porters," asked Esteban, "why could we not just as well recruit them from the nearest village?" "Such men would not go with us way to the coast," replied Awaza. "They are not porters. At best they would but carry our gold to the next village." "Why not that then?" inquired the Spaniard. "And at the next village we could employ porters to carry us on still farther, until we could employ other men to continue on with us." Awaza shook his head. "It is a good plan, Bwana, but we cannot do it, because we have nothing with which to pay our porters." Esteban scratched his head. "You are right," he said, "but it would save us that damnable trip to the coast and return." They sat for some moments in silence, thinking. "I have it," at last exclaimed the Spaniard. "Even if we had the porters now, we could not go directly to the coast for fear of meeting Flora Hawks's party. We must let them get out of Africa before we take the gold to the coast. 2 months will be none too long to wait, for they are going to have a devil of a time getting to the coast at all with that bunch of mutinous porters. While we are waiting, therefore, let us take one of the ingots of gold to the nearest point at which we can dispose of it for trade goods. Then we can return and hire porters to carry it from village to village." "The Bwana speaks words of wisdom," replied Awaza. "It is not as far to the nearest trading post as it is back to the coast, and thus we shall not only save time, but also many long, hard marches. In the morning, then, we shall return and unearth one of the ingots. But we must be sure that none of your men accompanies us, for no one must know, until it is absolutely necessary, where the gold is buried. When we return for it, of course, then others must know too, but inasmuch as we shall be with it constantly thereafter, there will be little danger of its being taken from us." And so, upon the following morning, the Spaniard and Awaza returned to the buried treasure, where they unearthed a single ingot. Before he left the spot, the Spaniard drew upon the inner surface of the leopard skin that he wore across his shoulder an accurate map of the location of the treasure, making the drawing with a sharpened stick, dipped in the blood of a small rodent he had killed for the purpose. From Awaza, he obtained the native names of the river and of such landmarks as were visible from the spot at which the treasure was buried, together with as explicit directions as possible for reaching the place from the coast. This information, too, he wrote below the map, and when he had finished, he felt much relieved from the fear that should aught befall Awaza, he might never be able to locate the gold. When Jane Clayton reached the coast to take passage for London, she found awaiting her a wire stating that her father was entirely out of danger, and that there was no necessity for her coming to him. She, therefore, after a few days of rest, turned her face again toward home and commenced to retrace the steps of the long, hot, weary journey that she had just completed. When finally she arrived at the bungalow, she learned, to her consternation, that Tarzan of the Apes had not yet returned from his expedition to the city of Opar after the gold from the treasure vaults. She found Korak, evidently much exercised, but unwilling to voice a doubt as to the ability of his father to care for himself. She learned of the escape of the golden lion with regret, for she knew that Tarzan had become much attached to the noble beast. It was the second day after her return that the Waziri who had accompanied Tarzan returned without him. Then indeed was her heart filled with fear for her lord and master. She questioned the men carefully, and when she learned from them that Tarzan had suffered another accident that had again affected his memory, she immediately announced that she would set out on the following day in search of him, commanding the Waziri who had just returned to accompany her. Korak attempted to dissuade her, but failing in that, insisted upon accompanying her. "We must not all be away at once," she said. "You remain here, my son. If I fail, I shall return and let you go." "I cannot let you go alone, mother," replied Korak. "I am not alone when the Waziri are with me," she laughed. "And you know perfectly well, boy, that I am as safe anywhere in the heart of Africa with them as I am here at the ranch." Yes, I suppose so," he replied, "but I wish I might go, or that Miriam were here." "Yes, I too wish that Miriam were here," replied Lady Greystoke. "However, do not worry. You know that my jungle craft, while not equal to that of Tarzan or Korak, is by no means a poor asset, and that surrounded by the loyalty and bravery of the Waziri, I shall be safe." "I suppose you are right," replied Korak, "but I do not like to see you go without me." And so, notwithstanding his objections, Jane Clayton set out the next morning with 50 Waziri warriors in search of her savage mate. When Esteban and Owaza had not returned to camp as they had promised, the other members of the party were at first inclined to anger, which was later replaced by concern, not so much for the safety of the Spaniard, but for fear that Owaza might have met with an accident and would not return to take them in safety to the coast, for of all the blacks he alone seemed competent to handle the surly and mutinous carriers. The Negroes scouted the idea that Owaza had become lost, and were more inclined to the opinion that he and Esteban had deliberately deserted them. Louvini, who acted as headman in Owaza's absence, had a theory of his own. "Owaza and the Bwana have gone after the ivory raiders alone. By trickery, they may accomplish as much as we could have accomplished by force, and there will only be two among whom to divide the ivory." "But how may two men overcome a band of raiders?" inquired Flora, skeptically. "You do not know Owaza," answered Louvini. "If he can gain the ears of their slaves, he will win them over, and when the Arabs see that he who accompanies Owaza and who fights at the head of the mutinous slaves is Tarzan of the Apes, they will flee in terror." "I believe he is right," muttered Krasky. "It sounds just like the Spaniard." And then suddenly he turned upon Louvini. "Can you lead us to the raiders' camp?" he demanded. "Yes," replied the Negro. "Good," exclaimed Krasky. "And now, Flora, what do you think of this plan? Let us send a swift runner to the raiders, warning them against Owaza and the Spaniard, and telling them that the latter is not Tarzan of the Apes, but an impostor. We can ask them to capture and hold the two until we come, and after we arrive, we can make such further plans as the circumstances permit. Very possibly we can carry out our original design after we have once entered their camp as friends." "Yes, that sounds good," replied Flora, "and it is certainly crooked enough, Just like you, yourself. The Russian blushed. Birds of a feather, he quoted. The girl shrugged her shoulders indifferently, but Bluber, who, with Peebles and Throck, had been silent listeners to the conversation, blustered. "What do you mean, birds with feathers?" he demanded. "Who was a crook? I tell you, Mr. Karkrasky, I am an honest man. Dot is wanting, dot no man don't say about Adolf Bluber, he is a crook." "Oh, shut up," snapped Krasky. "If there's anything in it, you'll be for it. If there's no risk. These fellows stole the ivory themselves and killed a lot of people probably to do it. In addition, they have taken slaves, which we will free." "Oh, well," said Bluber, "if it is fair and equitable, why, all right. But just remember, Mr. Krasky, I am an honest man." "Blime," exclaimed Throck, "we're all honest. I've never seen such a downy bunch of parsons in all me life." "Sure we're honest," roared John Peebles. "And anyone that says we ain't gets his ballyhead knocked off, and here we are, and that's that." The girl smiled wearily. "You can always tell honest men," she said. "They go around telling the world how honest they are, but never mind that. The thing now is to decide whether we want to follow Krasky's suggestion or not. It's something we've got all pretty well to agree upon before we undertake it. There are 5 of us. Let's leave it to a vote. Do we or don't we?" "Will the men accompany us?" asked Krasky, turning to Louvini. "If they are promised a share of the ivory, they will," replied the black. "How many are in favor of Carl's plan?" asked Flora. They were unanimously for it, and so it was decided that they would undertake the venture, and a half-hour later a runner was dispatched on the trail to the raiders' camp with a message for the raider chief. Shortly after, the party broke camp and took up its march in the same direction. A week later, when they reached the camp of the raiders, they found that their messenger had arrived safely and that they were expected. Esteban and Owaza had not put in an appearance, nor had anything been seen or heard of them in the vicinity. The result was that the Arabs were inclined to be suspicious and surly, fearing that the message brought to them had been but a ruse to permit this considerable body of whites and armed blacks to enter their stockade in safety. Jane Clayton and her Waziri, moving rapidly, picked up the spoor of Flora Hawks's safari at the camp where the Waziri had last seen Esteban, whom they still thought to have been Tarzan of the apes. Following the plainly marked trail and moving much more rapidly than the Hawks' safari, Jane and the Waziri made camp within a mile of the Ivory Raiders only about a week after the Hawks' party had arrived, and where they still remained, waiting either for the coming of Owaza and Esteban or for a propitious moment in which they could launch their traitorous assault upon the Arabs. In the meantime, Louvini and some of the other blacks had succeeded in secretly spreading the propaganda of revolt among the slaves of the Arabs. Though he reported his progress daily to Flora Hawks, he did not report the steady growth and development of a little private plan of his own, which contemplated, in addition to the revolt of the slaves and the slaying of the Arabs, the murder of all the whites in the camp, with the exception of Flora Hawks, whom Louvini wished to preserve, either for himself or for sale to some black sultan of the north. It was Louvini's shrewd plan to first slay the Arabs with the assistance of the whites, and then to fall upon the whites and slay them after their body servants had stolen their weapons from them. That Louvini would have been able to carry out his plan with ease, there is little doubt, had it not been for the loyalty and affection of a young black boy attached to Flora Hawks for her personal service. The young white woman, notwithstanding the length to which she would go in the satisfaction of her greed and avarice, was a kind and indulgent mistress. The kindnesses she had shown this ignorant little black boy were presently to return her dividends far beyond her investment. Louvini had been to her upon a certain afternoon to advise her that all was ready, and that the revolt of the slaves and the murder of the Arabs should take place that evening, immediately after dark. The cupidity of the whites had long been aroused by the store of ivory possessed by the raiders, with the result that all were more than eager for the final step in the conspiracy that would put them in possession of considerable wealth. It was just before the evening meal that the little Negro boy crept into Flora Hawks's tent. He was very wide-eyed and terribly frightened. "What is the matter?" she demanded. "Shish!" he cautioned. "Do not let them hear you speak to me, but put your ear close to me while I tell you in a low voice what Louvini is planning." The girl bent her head close to the lips of the little black. "You have been kind to me," he whispered, "and now that Louvini would harm you, I have come to tell you." "What do you mean?" exclaimed Flora in a low voice. "I mean that Louvini, after the Arabs are killed, has given orders that the black boys kill all the white men and take you prisoner. He intends to either keep you for himself or to sell you in the north for a great sum of money." "But how do you know all this?" demanded the girl. "All the blacks in camp know it," replied the boy. "I was to have stolen your rifle and your pistol, as each of the boys will steal the weapons of his white master." The girl sprang to her feet. "I'll teach that nigger a lesson," she cried, seizing her pistol and striding toward the flap of the tent. The boy seized her about the knees and held her. "No, no," he cried. "Do not do it. Do not say anything. It will only mean that they will kill the white men sooner and take you prisoner just the same. Every black boy in the camp is against you. Louvini has promised that the ivory shall be divided equally among them all. They are ready now, and if you should threaten Louvini, or if in any other way they should learn that you are aware of the plot, they would fall upon you immediately." "What do you expect me to do then?" she asked. "There is but one hope, and that is in flight. You and the white men must escape into the jungle. Not even I may accompany you." The girl stood, looking at the little boy in silence for a moment, and then finally she said, "Very well, I will do as you say. You have saved my life. Perhaps I may never be able to repay you, and perhaps, again, I may. Go now, before suspicion alights upon you." The black withdrew from the tent, crawling beneath the back wall to avoid being seen by any of his fellows who were in the center of the camp, from which the front of the tent was in plain view. Immediately, he was gone. Flora walked casually into the open and went to Krasky's tent, which the Russian occupied in common with Bluber. She found the two men, and in low whispers apprised them of what the black had told her. Krasky then called Peebles and Throck, it being decided that they should give no outward sign of holding any suspicion that aught was wrong. The Englishmen were for jumping in upon the blacks and annihilating them, but Flora Hawks dissuaded them from any such rash act by pointing out how greatly they were outnumbered by the natives and how hopeless it would be to attempt to overpower them. Bluber, with his usual cunning and shrewdness, which inclined always to double-dealing where there was the slightest possibility for it, suggested that they secretly advise the Arabs of what they had learned, and joining forces with them, take up as strong a position in the camp as possible, and commence to fire into the blacks without waiting for their attack. Again, Flora Hawks vetoed the suggestion. "It will not do," she said, "for the Arabs are at heart as much our enemies as the blacks. If we were successful in subduing the niggers, it would be but a question of minutes before the Arabs knew every detail of the plot that we had laid against them, after which Our lives would not be worth that. And she snapped her fingers. I guess Flora is right, as usual, growled Peebles. But what in hell are we going to do wandering around in this here jungle without no niggers to hunt for us, or cook for us, or carry things for us, or find our way for us? That's what I'd like to know. And here we are, and that's that. No, I guess there ain't nothing else to do, said Throck. But blime if I likes to run away, says I. Leastwise, not for no dirty niggers. There came then to the ears of the whites, rumbling from the far distance in the jungle, the roar of a lion. Oi, oi, cried Bloober. "We go out all alone in dot jungle? Mein Gott, I just as soon stay here and get killed like a wheat man." "They won't kill you like a white man," said Krasky. "They'll torture you if you stay." Bloober wrung his hands, and the sweat of fear rolled down his oily face. "Oi, why did I done it? Why did I done it?" he wailed. "Why didn't I stay home in London where I belong?" "Shut up," snapped Flora. "Don't you know that if you do anything to arouse the suspicion of these fellows, they will be on us at once? There is only one thing for us to do, and that is to wait until they precipitate the attack upon the Arabs. We will still have our weapons, for they do not plan to steal them from us until after the Arabs are killed. In the confusion of the fight, we must make our escape into the jungle, and after that, God knows, and God help us." "Yes," blubbered Bloober, who was in a blue funk. "God help us." A moment later, Louvini came to them. "All is ready, Buanas," he said. "As soon as the evening meal has been eaten, be in readiness. You will hear a shot. That will be the signal. Then open fire upon the Arabs." "Good," said Krasky. "We have just been talking about it, and we have decided that we will take our stand near the gate to prevent their escape." "It is well," said Louvini, "but you must remain here." He was addressing Flora. "It would not be safe for you to be where there is to be fighting. Remain here in your tent, and we will confine the fighting to the other side of the village and possibly to the gate, if any of them makes a break for escape." "All right," said Flora. "I will remain here, where it is safe." Satisfied that things could not have worked into his hands to better advantage, the black left them, and presently the entire camp was occupied with the evening meal. There was an atmosphere of restraint and high, nervous tension throughout the entire camp that must have been noticeable even to the Arabs, though they, alone of the entire company, were ignorant as to its cause. Bloober was so terrified that he could not eat, but sat white and trembling with his eyes roving wildly about the camp, first to the blacks, then to the Arabs, and then to the gate, the distance to which he must have measured 100 times as he sat there waiting for the shot that was to be the signal for the massacre that was to send him out into the jungle to be, he surely thought, the immediate prey of the first hunting lion that passed. Peebles and Throck ate their meal stolidly, much to Bloober's disgust. Krasky, being of a highly nervous temperament, ate but little, but he showed no signs of fear, nor did Flora Hawkes, though at heart she realized the hopelessness of their situation. Darkness had fallen. Some of the blacks and Arabs were still eating, when suddenly the silence was shattered by the sharp staccato report of a rifle. An Arab sank silently to the earth. Krasky rose and grasped Flora by the arm. "Come," he cried. Followed by Peebles and Throck, and preceded by Bloober, to whose feet fright had lent wings, they hurried toward the gate of the palisade. By now the air was filled with the hoarse cries of fighting men and the report of rifles. The Arabs, who had numbered but about a dozen, were putting up a game fight, and being far better marksmen than the blacks, the issue of the battle was still in doubt when Krasky opened the gate, and the 5 whites fled into the darkness of the jungle. The outcome of the fight within the camp could not have been other than it was, for so greatly did the blacks outnumber the Arabs that eventually, notwithstanding their poor marksmanship, they succeeded in shooting down the last of the nomads of the north. Then it was that Louvini turned his attention to the other whites, only to discover that they had fled the village. The black realized two things instantly. One was that someone had betrayed him, and the other that the whites could not have gone far in the short time since they had left the camp. Calling his warriors about him, he explained to them what had happened, and impressing upon them that the whites, if permitted to escape, would eventually return with reinforcements to punish the blacks, he aroused his followers, who now numbered over 200 warriors, to the necessity of setting out immediately upon the trail of the fugitives and overtaking them before they could carry word even to a neighboring village, the nearest of which was not more than a day's march distant.